Torah is just a long string of numbers. Some say that it's a code sent to us from God.
That's kind of interesting.
Yeah, that's just good stuff. Check this out, okay? The word for the Garden of Eden, Kedem. Numerical translation, 144. Now the value of tree of knowledge, all right, in the garden, right? Eitz HaChaim, 233. 144, 233. And you can take those numbers. So the,
You know, like the Fibonacci sequence.
Fibonacci.
Fibonacci is an Italian mathematician in the 13th century. If you divide 144 into 233, the result approaches theta.
Theta?
Theta. The Greek symbol for golden ratio, golden spiral.
Wow. I never saw that before. That's like that series you find in nature? Like the face of a sunflower?
Wherever the spirals.
You see this math everywhere.
Welcome back to the Gnostic Informant, and you are about to attain true gnosis. And as you can see in the title of this video, you know, I'm not being too clickbaity, but I admit it might be a little clickbaity because do I consider myself a mythicist? No, and obviously you know on this channel, I'm pretty critical of a lot of various proposals or theories about mythicism. The main one being the idea that there's any evidence for some sort of like older version of Christianity that goes back to Jews that were worshiping an angelic Jesus. Anyways, however, the current trends in academia that I've noticed, some trends that I'm noticing, is two pillars of biblical scholarship sort of being challenged from different angles by different people who don't even know each other. This is all just organically happening in different areas, different expertises. One of them is that the Old Testament is not that old. This has been an axiom in academia for since forever that yeah, there's Hellenistic parts of the Bible. Yeah, Cyrus probably wasn't mentioned by Isaiah, but there's definitely way older layers in the Bible. And now people are starting to challenge even that. People are starting to say, well, wait a minute, what about archaizing Hebrew? What about this? What about that? What about the evidence? What about elephantine? So that's one pillar that's it's in the war. There's a battle right there happening, which is amazing. But the other one is this axiom that no matter what you say about Jesus, whether you think he didn't rise from the dead, you think he was a drug dealer, or I'm just making stuff up, or you think he was just some hippie in the desert. No matter what you say about Jesus, you cannot say he didn't exist. You can't say that. That is an axiom in New Testament studies. We just know for sure he existed. You hear this from people like Bar Ehrman, who just kind of laugh at the idea that all scholars agree that Jesus existed. But some of the trends in scholarship that I've been noticing, for example, the Ken Olson, probably 10 years ago now, wrote an article that he thinks the Testimonium Flavianum and Josephus is completely forged, that Josephus never mentioned Jesus ever. But what's funny about that is his critics, Schultz wrote an article in like 2020 criticizing Ken Olson, saying there's no evidence of this. This is all nonsense. But even just like, even like the internet, history for atheists will will say like this so-called this testimony in Flavianum is settled. The passage was a wholesale forgery. And then admit, at the very least, the partial authenticity of the passage. Is if we're already dealing with something that's been messed with, so why would it be insane or completely off limits to go, wait a minute, what if the whole thing's forged? We're all in agreement. All the experts in Josephus who study Josephus, not all of them, I should say, the leading ones, like, Steve Mason, are like, yeah, no, this probably wasn't written by Josephus. It probably might have been, there might have been something there, which is what I think. But whatever this is not the same as what it was. We all agree on there. But for some reason, this idea of Ken Olson saying, I think the whole thing is forged, that's going too far. Well, now more people in the last couple of years have been agreeing with Ken Olson. Even people who I never would have thought would agree with Ken Olson are saying, no, I think he's right. On top of that, Josephus would be the first person outside of the Bible, so outside of Christian authors like Clement or Paul's epistles or the Gospels, to mention Jesus, which is going back all the way to the end of the 1st century. And now let's say Ken Olson's right. What does that bring us now? That brings us into the 2nd century. Pliny the Younger, Suetonius, and Tacitus are the next 3 people to even mention Jesus. And it turns out that there's other academics in other fields who will say stuff like this. This is from Oxford Academic Journal. An application of a profile-based method of authorship verification, investigating the authenticity of Pliny the Younger's letter to Trajan. And look, let's just read the abstract. And I'll put the link in the description for you guys to read it for yourself, because I'm not going to read the whole thing now. There it is in the chat. He says, after analyzing various kinds of internal and external evidence in favor of and against the authenticity of the letter, a modern stylometric method is applied in order to examine whether internal linguistic evidence allows one to definitely settle the debate. The findings of this analysis tend to contradict received opinion among modern scholars that affirm the authenticity of Pliny's letter and suggest instead the presence of large amounts of interpolation inside the letter. The stylistic behavior appears highly different from that of the rest of Book X. Where's all the Bible scholars bringing this up? I didn't know. This is from 2016. This has been out for a long time. Okay. All right. So then now all of a sudden, the first person to mention Jesus outside of Christian text is in the 3rd century. Third decade of the 2nd century. We're in the 120s now with Suetonius and Tacitus. So this is almost an entire century has gone by before anyone mentions a guy that was going around apparently rose from the dead and performed miracles. No one hears about it. No one writes about it. Almost 90 years go by, and Tacitus and Suetonius, when they talk about him, it's like they've just heard about him for the first time, as if they just heard the gospel legends in the 120s. Now, that still doesn't say anything about mythicism. That just says no one knew about this shit because probably the miracles didn't happen. Probably just some guy and they wrote miracles about him and then they heard about him. Okay, well, what's the evidence then? Then the next evidence, well, we got Paul, we got Ignatius, we got Clement. Well, now you have people like Nina Livesey and others who Derek just had on yesterday, Marcus Vincent, Nina Livesey saying, I think all of Paul's letters are forged. Marcus Vincent is saying, I think the Gospels are all sort of written. I think the first Gospel was written by Marcion, first of all, which is weird because that puts you in the 2nd century. And then all the Gospels come after that. And the Gospels are a product of the 2nd century. All of a sudden now Paul and the Gospels are being shifted into the 2nd century. And so the Old Testament is getting challenged as being not that old, probably Hellenistic, if not at the very least Persian period. And now the New Testament is being challenged as being mostly forged, mostly made up, and mostly way after the facts of a century later after Jesus. So all of a sudden, mythicism is back on the table. But it's a lot more simpler mythicism than having to construct this pre-existing religion that we have no evidence for. It's just simple. They just made this shit up and backdated themselves. So I've said enough here. I want to bring on the expert on this, who's been writing on this subject probably longer than I've even thought about this stuff. Probably longer than I've been, I don't know, maybe alive. Without further ado, Dr. Robert M. Price in the house. So I spoke a lot. I want to let you take the floor on everything I just kind of talked about and get your thoughts on what's going on in the trends in scholarship, your thoughts on Marcus Vincent, your thoughts on Nina Livesey, your thoughts on Josephus and all, and like the historical evidence of Jesus. And is Mythicism making a comeback?
Well, I've never been too sure who supports it and who doesn't. I'm sure Richard Carrier has been consistent in supporting it, though with some arguments I can't really see. But it seems to me that you have more openness among scholars to the idea of mythicism than you used to. And I'm thinking, for instance, of the late, great Philip R. Davies, an Old Testament minimalist. And to step back a bit there, Old Testament minimalism, the idea that virtually all of it, whenever it was written, was fictitious. Some of the stuff about King Omri and so forth, the less interesting stuff closer to the present, that may have been based on historical individuals, but David, Solomon, Moses, forget it. The first major minimalist who went beyond that stuff and said that, Abraham, all of these guys did not exist. And this was Thomas L. Thompson, and a lot of his case was based on archaeology. Like, there's no real evidence for a united kingdom of Israel and Judah, or that there was a kingdom of Judah. It was mainly a kind of trade system for olive farmers and so on.
And even if those places did exist, the 12 tribes definitely didn't exist.
Yeah.
Like, you might have had a Judah and Israel going on, but the whole idea that they're allotted into 12 different sections is not historical. There's no archaeological evidence at all. The sources don't mention this. It's all in the Bible.
Plus, like as Albrecht Alt said decades ago, you have to assume that the idea of the 12 tribes being the descendants of 12 sons of a single man, that is just a kind of legal fiction of a common type in the ancient Near East and Eastern Mediterranean, where you would have either sometimes 6, usually 12 tribe confederations, originally independent, who got together as a kind of, around the common care of a central shrine. Each might have had their own god or gods, but they got together with a single federal god. And if it was 12, then each tribe had a charge of the upkeep of the central shrine 1 month out of the year. If it was 6, the alternate months and so on. But the particular names of the tribes, which are not, it's like the disciples in the Gospels, the list of tribal names are not totally consistent. They're different names here and there, marginally in the different mentions, but some of those names are not even personal names, like Ephraim. It's a plural noun meaning those who live on Mount Ephrath. Or Issachar, it means migrant laborer. Some of them are named for gods worshipped by the tribes, like Gad was the god of good luck. Asher was obviously Asherah, and Zebulon, I'm sure, was Zebul and so forth. So Al said that the whole idea that there were interrelated tribes, that's a legal fiction, and everybody knew it. It's like saying, oh yeah, we're blood brothers now. It's not like a deception or a hoax or something.
And it's funny, I'll hear people say like, oh, my family goes back to the tribe of Gad, and I'm just like, how do you know this? Like, somebody in somebody in 1890 just decided we're Gad, and then they wrote that down, and then And then that goes from family to family, family member to family, and then all of a sudden it's a family thing that we've always passed this down. We've always known. No, you didn't.
And why not? It's all right if people
No, I don't
want
care.
to,
I'm just saying,
but
when I
it's
hear
not
that,
something historians should accept. It's like accepting
right?
Santa Claus.
Exactly.
And I'm a big fan of Santa. I even look like Santa. But if that doesn't mean I think there was the real Santa Claus at the North Pole and so forth. Well, I've gone far afield here, but what Thompson did was to say, yeah, let's face it, the stuff is not historical. Well, even critical scholars in the mainstream for about a decade said, oh, no, wait a minute. There was an Abraham, there was a David, and all that stuff. But as he and others began to produce more evidence and more arguments, things changed. Like poor Thompson was making his living for a decade painting houses. He couldn't get a teaching job anyplace because they thought he was a nut. But in about 10 years, people said, this guy was right. We're going to catch hell for saying this, but he's right. It's all fictional. And now about it being right.
The Greeks would do this too. The Greeks would say, we're Herculean. My descendants go back to Hercules.
That's right. Yeah, it was a common thing. And in a way, it's like saying, here's the person I think we ought to model ourselves on. Like the Stoics used Hercules as a moral example and so forth. Well, this is just a notch over from that. Well, Davies was one of these minimalists, and he and others began to say, a lot of these archaeological and literary critical considerations are equally applicable to the Gospels. Who knows if that is any more history-based? Maybe not. And of course, there had been mythicists before this, but it was always viewed as a kind of harebrained tinfoil hat kind of a thing, but not so much anymore. And for a long time, I was like a Bultmannian. I said, yeah, there must have been a Jesus. It was some kind of a prophet of eschatological repentance, like Albert Schweitzer said, and so forth. And he got transmogrified in legends, and Easter probably was based on some kind of visions these guys had. But then what really
notice how all of that's all just probably, I don't know, none of that is that what everything he says, because I actually really like Albert Schweitzer. I actually really think his book's awesome. But I don't agree with all the things he says. And I think it's outdated because he's just basically looking at the data and just kind of guessing where everything fits based on some axioms. Based on the axiom, well, he had to have existed. So if he existed, then okay, he probably was just some guy who was prophesying about the future, and maybe he got a few things right, and it blew everyone's mind, and then they wrote, stuff like that.
But you're right. The bottom line was, now, of course, there was a Jesus, and he may have been not what you think. We got to have the guts to be willing to face that if it's true. But the idea that there was no Jesus, well, it seems to me that becomes more and more likely, almost inevitable, when you look at further scholarship by Thomas L. Brodie and John Dominic Crossan, though he doesn't come to this final conclusion, but several others that say, it's odd how closely every story in the Gospels is to some Old Testament story. Sometimes the elements are reshuffled, but that gets into mimesis and all that stuff that Dennis MacDonald comes up with. And I made a list of this and did an article about it called New Testament narrative as Old Testament midrash. And I said, there are some highly unlikely arguments, but in my judgment, you can point out very plausible Old Testament bases for every gospel narrative and plenty in Acts. Now, you got to ask yourself, what's more plausible? That a lot of astonishing miracles happened as if there was really a Superman, or that people rewrote well-known holy stories on behalf of a new figurehead? Well, then you don't have a time machine. You weren't there. You don't know what happened. Historians deal in probabilities, and you'd have to admit that the idea that is it more likely Jesus multiplied fish and bread, or that somebody rewrote the well-known story where Elisha already had done it, etc., etc. You got to say, well, yeah, it looks like it's rewritten from the Old Testament. And I suggested to Marcus Vincent once, I said, I see you figure that Marcion wrote the first gospel. Makes sense to me. My guess is that the origin of all the gospel stories come from Marcion, who rejected the Old Testament, not as pernicious, not as if it was the satanic Bible or something, but that it's just not Christian. It doesn't predict Jesus. Don't co-opt the Jewish scripture. But he liked a lot of it. Who wouldn't? And so he rewrote that about Jesus, and which is not far away from what more Orthodox Christians said for a long time, that all these things were typological anticipations. Yeah, Jesus is just like Joseph and all that, but it really happened. Come on. And that's what, but it was on such a basis that they said, well, if Joseph did it, Jesus must have done it. If Moses did it, Jesus must have done it. And if that's the case, then what evidence can there be for a historical Jesus? Conceivably, there was one, but it's an unnecessary hypothesis now.
Yeah, there's this. So Eusebius, by the way, people think he's the one that wrote the Testimonium Flavianum. It's possible. That's a very good. I think it's a decent. It should be taken seriously, that theory. But he wrote this text right here called "Preparation for the Gospel." Latin, I think it's Preparatio Evangelica. And in this book, this book is so exactly what you were just describing. What is he doing? Is he going to the prophets and talking about them, how they prophesied Jesus? No, he's going to the Greek philosophers and to the ancient pagan, like Phoenician sources. He's talking about things that, Plato said, things that Sanchuniathon said, Philo, Biblos. He talks about Zoroaster and things that were done in Homer. Things from Homer's epics that point to Jesus. And he's going, look, even the Greeks didn't even realize, but the hand of God was there. The muse was behind them. It's like, what happened to this mentality? And the reason why this mentality existed, and by the way, he's not alone in this. Firmicus Maternus was a writer who also wrote very similar style. Justin Martyr did this. Clement of Alexandria did this. Maybe not to the highest degree, but they all dabbled in this idea that the Greeks had, some inspiration. Plato was like Moses, but with just, of a Greek Moses, all this kind of nonsense. But the point is that the reason why you have this kind of stuff, because they had to deal with the pagans in this time. The pagans were still around. How do you get them over? How do you get them to join your movement? And this is why you don't see this anymore. You don't get Christians today digging into Homer looking for Jesus. Because there's no reason.
Lewis adopted that basic idea. He said that all of the pagan myths of divine incarnation and dying and rising gods were little glimpses. It's almost a Jungian thing, that these were archetypes, you might say, that expressed the yearning of people for a savior to come in real life. And finally, like the famous title of an essay of his, Myth Became Fact. Well, to me, all right, logically, that makes sense. It's not self-contradictory, but isn't it obvious it's special pleading and totally circular? And then the other major early Christian views, still held by some, was that all of the dying and rising gods, virgin births, etc., were satanic counterfeits in advance, that Satan understood the Old Testament prophecies as predictions of Jesus and said, I got it. I'm going to throw these buffoons off the track before Jesus shows up, because I know the timetable. I'm going to make phony copies of it so that when the real thing comes, they'll think it's just another fake.
Yeah.
Well, that one
It
thing
was a popular idea.
apologists never seem to realize is you are admitting that the
Yes.
other dying and rising gods are pre-Christian,
And
and
by the
some
way, not only
apologists say, "Oh no, they're
and
borrowed from Christianity."
not only that, before Christianity even existed, there were Jews in Alexandria. Philo's one of them, and Aristobulus, Artapanus. There's a few of them. That point out they're arguing that Moses influenced Plato. Like, why is they're all writing? Why is Plato so similar to Moses in his view of God, the transcendent one? Well, because he had to borrow from Moses. That's what they're saying. And then you even got them going as far as saying that Moses is Musaeus of Athens, who was a student of Orpheus. Or I'm saying, in their version, he's the teacher of Orpheus. In the Greek version, he's the student of Orpheus. They flip it. And go, no. Moses taught Orpheus, and that's how Plato got it. But now, what does that tell you? That tells you that they're admitting that their theology is Platonic.
And now Russell Gmirkin shows in detail that the Bible stories about Moses, etc., and the law codes and all that are borrowed from Plato. So these guys were right. There's a link.
Yeah, Plato's not going, why is Moses so similar to me? Or, like, they don't mention Moses. It's not on their radar. None of the pre-Socratics. Guess how many of the pre-Socratics mentioned Israel or Moses or the Torah? Zero. No one talks about it. The first Greek to mention Israel is Hecataeus of Abdera. Maybe all we have is pseudo Hecataeus and I think he did. I think I'm fine with accepting the fragments. So we're talking 320, first time the Greeks start writing about Israel, and it's very similar to in Christianity with the Romans finding out about Jesus. Way later in the game, 2nd century, all the way in the third decade of the 2nd century, they're finally learning about Jesus, all of this great Messiah, right? And so, like, I don't know, the dates are shifting. We're moving farther into the future for both Old Testament and New Testament. They're both moving along at like a scale, like a gradient scale.
Yeah, the pretense of antiquity was sort of a way of saying that we're dealing with ancient eternal truths here. It's the more venerable, the older it is. But there are already hints that people knew that wasn't the case. Like in 4th Ezra, there's this very strange story that just after the exile, God told Ezra to mix up some visionary drink and gulp it down, and he would be divinely inspired to replace the Tanakh, which had been totally destroyed during the exile. What a claim. And so that all through the night he's dictating and okay, there's the whole thing, plus another 70 books, like pseudepigraphical books, only for the elite and so forth. Now, what's the point of a story like that? You're admitting that scripture was completely destroyed. Well, what they're doing is winking and telling you that none of this stuff existed before the exile. It was all written later.
Well, what's so fascinating about that is in Plato himself, in the Republic, where he explains, if you want people to really honor the laws, you have to make them think that it's so ancient that it goes all the way back to the gods and the heroes, and it was passed down, and it's so holy that, and like he explains this whole thing of antiquity is important for like most of these theologians, because, and like, I can see a Platonist, I can see 2nd, 3rd century AD Platonists looking at like what the Jews have in their established canon and being kind of jealous, going, these people believe that they got these like Moses and Abraham, and this is antiquity. This is going back into the times way before Rome even existed. And like, what do they have? They have Homer. They have all these poets. But I can see them almost being like, they got it figured. Like, these guys have an antiquity going on. But like that actually, to me, in an evolutionary sense, I think people ask, how did Christianity win out? Well, I don't know if you can say won out. I think it adapts to the other cultures that are winning out at the same time, which is Middle Platonism and Neoplatonism. And the Platonists aren't really concerned with being dogmatic about myths, whereas Christians are concerned about being dogmatic about their myths. You have to believe there's a Trinity. You have to believe he rose and died. You have to believe Adam and Eve. And that's like, that's their central, they push that forward, where the Platonists are more concerned with philosophy, ethics, arete, virtue, and being pious, and all those things that the Christians also adopt. But you can see how both of them win out, and they both get what they want. The Platonists get what they want because their philosophy ends up being the dominant philosophy of Western civilization all the way until today, pretty much. And the Christians get what they want because their myths are the ones that everyone believes in. So they all win. Nobody lost. Everyone won, if you think about it in that sense. It's like it's just evolution. Those were the survival of the fittest. It was those two things.
And it's advantageous to confuse them together, as when people today say, oh, well, the Judeo-Christian ethic and so forth, that's the basis of our laws. No, it's not. It's Roman law and English common law. There's no democracy in the Bible. There's no idea of free speech and rights and all that. It's not incompatible with it, but those things are the result of the Enlightenment, in turn based on classical culture. But people solidly believe, oh yeah, this is biblical stuff.
Yeah, and that's just, I don't know. But anyways, I want to do a couple super chats that we have just to catch up, and let's keep going with this conversation. And these are good super chats. Derek from Myth Vision Podcast in the house says, good to see Dr. Price with Neil. He's the most fun scholar I've ever interviewed. Hopefully soon we're going to be back recording with Bob. Love you both. Thank you for that super chat. Appreciate that.
Yeah. Good to be back in the fellowship.
Back in the brothel.
Hallelujah.
You're the arch brothel priest. Anyways, Elwa Sabao says, any verses you think are smoking guns for mythicism in prophecy Old Testament? Oh, this reminds me of something. Do you have anything? I got something right away for this. You want to think, if you don't mind? Can I pull? I actually was going to bring this up anyway. So here, let me show you what I got real quick. I actually had this prepared for you. I want to get your thoughts on it. But this is a great question. Thank you for the super chat. So this is from Cross Bible, obviously. I took a screenshot. Now, this is from Lamentations, chapter 4, verse 20. So, okay, let me give you a little rundown of what's going on for Lamentations. Lamentations is supposedly written by Jeremiah in Babylon, weeping over what just happened. Why are we in Babylon? Why are we back in Jerusalem? Why is God doing this? Now, what he says in this chapter, I've never noticed until recently. And I was doing some research on something completely unrelated, and I stumbled on this and put it in my mythicism folder, because I was like, this actually supports mythicism in a big way. And the reason why is, let me just read it first and then I'll explain. So I have the group over Greek over here, pneuma, right? That means Holy Spirit. And then you have over here in the Hebrew, ruach, which is also the word for breath, wind, Holy Spirit in Hebrew, or spirit, I should say. And pneuma also has the same exact translation as ruach. It means breath, spirit, or wind. So it's hard to tell which one comes from where, but this concept goes back to the pre-Socratics. This doesn't. This is a biblical term. This goes back to the pre-Socratics. So this concept might be from the Greeks. It might be from the Persians. I don't know. I'm not talking about that right now. The point is, then it goes on to say, Christos Kurios Sunelithen, the Lord's anointed, and I think this is a bad translation. It should say, our Holy Spirit, I think it should say, the Lord's anointed, Holy Spirit, was caught in their traps. We thought that under his shadow, we would live among the nations. So Jeremiah now this becomes a messianic prophecy. Whenever you have Messiah, right here, Messiah, and then you have Christos, Christ, Messiah, Hebrew Messiah, Greek Christ, and he's caught in the traps. He says, our very spirit, look at it says right here, our very spirit, the Lord's anointed, our very spirit was caught in their traps. We thought that under his shadow, we would live among the nations. Are you serious? That sounds like what happened after 70 AD in Bar Kokhba.
Hmm.
The temple gets destroyed, okay, in 70 AD, and then they they're still alive after that for a little bit longer, and then Bar Kokhba is like the nail in the coffin, and then what? And then all of a sudden, this is a reality now. The Lord's anointed, the Holy Spirit, was caught in the traps of Rome, and now the Jews are going to live among the nations. The next verse is even more important, because then it says, rejoice and be glad, daughter Edom, which becomes Rome later on. You who live in the land of Uz, but to you also the cup will be passed. You will be drunk and stripped naked. It's almost like a picture of what happens in Revelation with Rome. So I can see Christians in the 2nd century or maybe late 1st century going back to Jeremiah, digging for messianic prophecy about a fallen dead Messiah. And this is I don't know. What do you think about this? Am I wrong? Is my exegesis off here?
Well, would they have recognized this as corresponding to something they already believed about Jesus, or would this be one of the things that led them to conceptualize Jesus?
That's the question. Depending on how you, so if you're going to take the position that you don't think Jesus existed, then the way to explain this would be that they're constructing a crucified Messiah from Jeremiah and Isaiah. Obviously, Isaiah's got the suffering motif. And then right here in Jeremiah, well, this is actually Lamentations, but it goes along with Jeremiah. Jeremiah is saying that the Lord's Messiah, the Holy Spirit, the pneuma, by the way, we shouldn't look at the Hebrew for determining what Christians are doing. We should look at the Greek, because they're reading the Septuagint. So it usually has that pre-Socratic buzzword, the pneuma. So the spirit of the Lord's Messiah, the spirit, our spirit, was caught up in their traps, and under his shadow we live among the nations, is what it's saying. That sounds like a messianic verse. Now, the other option is, let's say Jesus did exist. The other way you explain this is, well, he got crucified and he didn't save us. So how the hell does that make sense? And then you go digging in for prophecy and you go, oh, look what Jeremiah said. Jeremiah said the Lord's anointed would be caught. Oh shit, Jesus, maybe Jesus really was the Messiah. So I can see it going both ways, but honestly, I do not think the latter is stronger in any way. I think they're both are possible.
Well, it's certainly
if we go with the axiom they didn't exist, though, and then we go with like Nina Livesey saying Paul is later, then you end up looking at verses like this in that light, is what I'm saying. Depends on what you're using as your axiom.
The fact that you have the Lord's anointed, I think, why did Matthew think that Hosea 11:1 was about Jesus? Out of Egypt I have called my son. He knew that was about the Exodus. The guy was very educated. He knew 3 languages, as you can tell from his gospel. He knew that wasn't the original meaning, but it was like Qumran. They said, if you know how to read it, you can find hidden messages. And what would have tipped them off? Well, in Hosea, it was my son. Hey, we say Jesus was the Son of God, so he must have been in Egypt. Well, here, it would be the same sort of thing. What's this? The Lord's anointed was taken in their pits. Maybe there's this hidden message about Jesus. These guys weren't like Hal Lindsey, saying that these were explicit predictions that any idiot could have seen. That it was more sophisticated, though also arbitrary. They were decoding the text, not to prove Christianity, but in light of Christianity, they said, now we can recognize after the fact things that were predicted.
And by the way, if anyone out there, because I've seen people do this, they push back in the idea of like digging into Old Testament and like looking for what could be taken as prophecy for Christ. Like they'll go, no, that's wrong. Jeremiah was talking about Babylon, and he was talking about one specific thing, and that's the context of this verse. And everyone, like, as if 1,000 years, I'm just going to say 400 years goes by, however old Jeremiah is by the time the Gospels are being written. Half a century or half a millennium later, all of a sudden people are going to read it differently. The context is going to change. They're going to read it and they're going to think about their modern times. And by the way, if you think that I'm just making this up because I just decided to, this is what Josephus tells us in the Jewish War. When he writes about the Essenes, I actually can pull this up. I actually have a bookmark in here somewhere. I was just looking at it. When he writes about the Essenes in the Jewish War, he says that their practice among the Essenes is to go into scripture and rewrite scripture for modern events. He says it right here. I'm going to pull it up in a second. But anyways, what are your thoughts on that while I pull this up?
Yeah, in fact, there's a modern example of this that isn't about Jesus, but shows the same kind of quasi methodology. You know how some people say that Jeremiah was predicting and condemning in advance Christmas trees, where he says they take a tree from the forest and hang gold and silver upon it and so forth. And they say, oh, that's Christmas tree ornaments. No, it's not. It's just like in Isaiah, where it says they cut down a tree trunk, strip it of the bark and branches, and then gild it with gold, and the idiots worship it as a god, even though they created it. That's the point in Jeremiah. And might be, this is the thing you're pointing out with Jeremiah or Lamentations. It's like as if Christians said, oh, yes, I know it was originally about making idols out of trees and all that, but now we can see it was predicting prophetically having a Christmas tree in your living room. I don't think anybody does that. They think that's literally the point of it, but it's the same kind of decoding exegesis.
Yeah, I'm still looking for that passage, but yeah, I think this idea of like they're constructing, so there's no doubt that they're using Old Testament motifs to construct the life of Jesus. When you start getting into that, you're already giving away the historical aspect of this, because the idea that this guy was just walking around doing things that mirror everything in the Old Testament is it's bizarre to think that that's how history works, and that no one noticed it. For example, like the idea that there's the trial going on, and it's almost mimicking what happens on Yom Kippur, where they let one goat out and they sacrifice the other lamb or goat, whatever it is, in the temple area as the salvation, right? And the sin offering gets sent out in the wilderness, the sinful one, the Azazel, right? Well, Jesus and Barabbas is like a metaphor of that. It's analogous to that. And you think people are just going to sit around and go, wait a minute, why are we reenacting Yom Kippur for these two people on trial? Like no one is just going to go along with that. They're not like robots. They're people with free will. So it's like you have to, at some point, you have to at least go, well, if they're using all the Old Testament motifs and applying to Jesus, then is this history at all? Or is this all just reconstruction of the Old Testament?
Yeah, in John Dominic Crossan's book, my favorite book by him, The Cross That Spoke, but also in one of his other ones about Jesus explicitly, he does an amazing job of showing the importance of the whole scapegoat ritual that you're talking about, and how if you compare that to the so-called testimonia, the constantly quoted Old Testament passages taken out of context as prophecies, like in the Epistle of Barnabas, for example, but elsewhere as well. He says all these details we see in the Gospels reflect the details of the scapegoat ritual. And I kept waiting for Crossan to say, you see, this, well, in fact, in the book about, I think, Who Killed Jesus, he says, you see what's going on here? Prophecy is being made into history. Well, that's what he does in more detail in The Cross That Spoke. And I kept waiting for him to say, you see, the whole thing is midrash. It's a story constructed out of bits and pieces that meant something else originally. And they knew that. Right. They weren't lying about it. They just figured, oh, we've got the scoop. But he never goes that far because he wants a historical Jesus.
and they're adding in other motifs of surrounding cultures, whether it be Egyptian, Osirian
Oh yeah.
stuff implied, or Greek stuff, or like Dionysian elements in John or Mark,
Mhm.
and they're constructing a pretty much a masterpiece of mythology using
Mhm.
Old Testament motifs and surrounding Greco-Roman motifs. It's really
Mhm.
well done, but like
Oh
at the end of
yeah.
the day, it's not history anymore. Once you start doing that, you're not writing history anymore. The Greek Alexander romance probably has a lot of things that happened. He did travel to the east. He did defeat Darius. He did fight with the Indians. But a lot of the major things that happened in the Greek Alexander romance is myth. He didn't fly up into the sky and meet a dragon. He didn't jump. He didn't take a sip of water that gave him eternal life, or whatever the hell that happened in that passage. There's all this mythology happening to Alexander the Great. And by the way, in the Alexander the Great romance, those are motifs that already predate Alexander. For example, his birth of the serpent of Zeus, or Serapis coming in the form of or Ammon coming in the form, who's Zeus, by the way. Ammon Zeus comes in the form of a dragon and impregnates Olympias. Well, what happens with the birth of Zagreus? Zeus, in the form of a dragon, impregnates Persephone. So like he's getting the same treatment Jesus gets in
Yeah.
the Greek Alexander romance. But you don't see people acting like everything that happens in the romance is history. They don't treat it that way. So anyways, but yeah, oh yeah, I found that passage. So let me just read this off and we'll go to the next super chat. Thank you for this super chat, Elwa. So this is what they say about the Essenes. This is Josephus, Jewish War, Book 2, Chapter 8. And he says their doctrine is this: the bodies are corruptible, and that matter they are made of is not permanent, but the souls are immortal, continue forever. That's Platonism. That's Orphic Platonism, Pythagoreanism. That's Greek. The body, the incorruptible soul is Platonism. That's Middle Platonism. Anyways, so we're off the bat. The Essenes have the Middle Platonist doctrine of the incorruptible soul, and then it says, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. It says these are the divine doctrines of the Essenes, which lay unavoidable bait for such who have taste of their philosophy. There are also among them who undertake to foretell things to come. So let me rephrase that. There are those among them who prophesy the future by reading the holy books and using several sorts of purifications and being perpetual conservant in the discourses of the prophets. And it is but seldom that they miss in their predictions. That means they're going back into Isaiah, the prophets. He says it specifically. They're going back into Isaiah, they're going back into Jeremiah, and they're going back into Micah, and they're prophesying the future, like Revelation or the book of or John's Gospel, like whatever. That's an Essene tradition right there, and they believe in Platonism, the incorruptibility of the soul. So you already have a proto-Christian image right there in front of your face in Josephus.
Oh yeah, yeah. They lived in a world where they weren't trying to dissect all the different influences and keep them hermetically sealed off from one another. It's not just some kind of modern bias that posits syncretism. That though this is Hellenistic and this is Jewish, well, yeah, what of it? They lived in a world where those things were all intermixing. And yeah, that's true. The fact that it's not history and you can reveal it as fiction, to me, that makes the Bible so much more fascinating and great literarily. When people say, "Oh, you're debunking the Bible," I say, "No, no, no. I am the defender of the Bible. I am the champion of the Bible. You're straitjacketing it." And I will not allow people to say that I'm anti-Bible.
We love our Bible here. We love our Greek and Hebrew. I love this stuff. So Jane Kamari, speaking of pagan influence, we were already getting into that. Jane Kamari, thank you for the super chat, says, do you think pagans influence Christ? I'll let you take that away.
Well, that depends on whether Jesus was a cynic-like sage, as some think, because the closest parallels to the the uniquely Jesus sayings in the Gospels, like giving up all your possessions to the poor and assuming the itinerant life. The only other people we know of who did that were the cynics, and we know that they were that Christian itinerant apostles were often confused with cynics, and that there were people going back and forth between the two movements. And so, if that is so, then you've got definite Hellenistic influence there. But then, Martin Hengel, a pretty conservative scholar, he said, look, Palestine was saturated with Hellenism and had been for a long time. The institution of a rabbi with disciples comes from the Plato's Academy and the Peripatetics, with the approach of allegorizing scripture, and these aren't supposedly rabbinic techniques like the lesser and greater, interpret this one by that one. This is all borrowed from Hellenism. Not that that is some betrayal of Judaism. These people were broad-minded and educated. They knew something was good when they saw it. And just like the Greeks and Romans, like when Greeks discovered the religion of Osiris in Egypt, what did they say? You know, this sounds so much like our Dionysus. They didn't say it must have been a satanic imitation. They said, I bet this is the same God with a different local name. I mean, syncretism was just common sense.
Yeah.
And Judaism participated in that. What's the problem? Well, I'll tell you what the problem is. Apologists want everything in the Bible and Christianity to be directly revealed from heaven. They want it to be good news, not good views, as the slogan goes.
Yeah.
And so if you say, well, they probably derived this from that. Oh, no, they didn't. They got it directly by divine inspiration. That's just not a historical way of looking at it.
Yeah, and so as you mentioned, like this region was completely Hellenized by the time you get to especially this late first century, where we're talking now, it's completely Romanized and everything. But the Greeks were there. The Greeks get there after Alexander the Great. By the way, this place right here, Benias, I was there myself. There's a natural spring in a grotto where there is a temple to the god Pan, built by the army of Alexander the Great on their way down to Egypt. So there you have sanctuaries of Greek gods all over the place. By the way, this is right near Nazareth. So this is like, if you know where Golan Heights is, it's less than an hour away. It's I don't know, I would say a half hour, maybe 40 minutes. Look, there's Lake Tiberias is a small lake. I was in Lake Tiberias. I went on a boat in there, very, very tiny. It's right there. And so there's the worshiping Pan there. Anyways, by the time you get to the first century AD, you have the theater of Sepphoris, which is even closer to Nazareth. Sepphoris basically is Nazareth. I mean, it's like saying Boston and New England, like they're the same region. Like Sepphoris is the greater city of the Nazareth, what we would say Nazareth region is. Nazareth is like a little outside hub, like a little suburb of Sepphoris. In Sepphoris, where Jesus, if he lived, really would have, if Jesus did exist, he would have been there. He would have been trading there, going to the market there. They have a giant theater in there that was probably built by Herod in that early first century. And so is watching theater, Dionysus plays, what's going on? Like whoever's living in that region would be Hellenized. So this idea that they're like blocked off from the rest of the Mediterranean world is some completely nonsense. And as you pointed out, like whenever they're not doing mimesis for the Old Testament, it's almost like every chance they get, they're doing mimesis of something else, something from Euripides. Quotes like "Don't kick against the goads." That's Paul says that. That's in the Bacchae.
Yeah, loads of stuff in Acts is from the Bacchae.
Yeah, it's like if I said to you, Houston, we have a problem, you would know that's a cultural phrase that's been used over and over and over and over again. Well, those type of cultural phrases end up in the New Testament all over the place. Like Cretans are always all liars. You find that in Titus. That goes back to a bunch of different writers, going back to a myth about Medea. going back way into the classical period. So like this, they're locked in step with the rest of the surrounding culture. They're not
In
different.
fact, that one
at
has
all.
to do with dying and rising gods, because Epimenides is there. Two Acts has one half of this, and Titus the other, because they're both written by the same guy. Those New Testament books. Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, lazy gluttons, for they say, your Zeus, you were killed, and your tomb is on display in Crete. But thou art not dead. In thee all things live and move and have their being. That's the whole thing. Well, they're talking, when this is about Zeus being gored by a boar, just like Adonis, but rising from the dead. So that's even tucked away.
And you're right, because they're talking about the tomb of Zeus, and
Mhm.
people are going, no, Zeus doesn't have a tomb. Zeus is immortal. But there are other people on the other side. The more I guess you would say, like, going towards, they're modern in their sense, because they were thinking, no, the gods actually lived on Earth, and Zeus had a body, and he had a tomb, and they're arguing over that in the same way that the Christians are arguing with the Docetists over if he had a body or not.
Right.
So they have the same issues going on. But as you pointed out, Epimenides goes back to the 6th century BC, using this phrase: Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, idle bellies. And then Callimachus also uses this in the Hellenistic period. So this is well known. And then obviously the epistle to Titus. But the original context actually goes back to a story of Medea calling the Cretans liars because she didn't get voted as being the most beautiful. I'm trying to find it. I don't know why they don't have it in this article. But yeah, it's in. But yeah, that's what happened. There it is. According to Ptolemaeus Kennis, Thetis and Medea had once argued. And the reason why I'm reading this is because people say, well, that doesn't make it pagan. That makes it more philosophical. The philosophers, that's not pagan. Well, no, you're wrong. It is pagan, because look what Ptolemy Kennis says. Thetis and Medea had argued in Thessaly over which was the most beautiful. They appointed Cretan Idomeneus as the judge, who gave the victory to Thetis. In her anger, Medea called all the Cretans liars and cursed them to never say the truth. So the idea that, oh, this isn't pagan because it's just the philosophers that are saying this. No, the pagans or the philosophers are citing a pagan myth about Medea and Thetis, the goddess of justice. So at the end, it always goes back to the pagans in some way.
Yeah.
Anyways.
Nor would these people have denied it. They weren't fundamentalist apologists.
Right. And just to show people what happens here, how the Christians take this over, you get the epistle to Titus, one of Crete's own prophets. He calls him a prophet.
Yes.
He doesn't call him a fallen pagan. He calls him a prophet.
Yeah.
A guy who has the ability to predict the future. Cretans are always liars, evil brutes, idle bellies. And he has surely told the truth. He didn't call him a pagan liar that was following false gods. For this reason, correctly, this sternly, that they may sound in faith instead of paying attention to Jewish fables. That sounds Marcion, right? That sounds Marcionite, right? Yeah. And to commandments of people who turn their backs on the truth. And then it says, Clement of Alexandria, then he uses it. In his epistle to Titus, Apostle Paul warns us, Titus, that Cretans don't believe in the one truth of Christianity because Cretans are always liars. Now, wait a minute. Does that mean Medea is canonized in Christianity? Because Medea is the one that made this prophecy, and it came true according to the Christians. So how is that not a pagan roots of something? You know what I'm saying? Like, she's the one that made this up, and the Christians are like, yeah, Medea was spot on.
Good old Saint Medea.
Isn't that crazy though?
Wow.
But anyways, any more examples of paganism influencing Christianity?
Examples of
pagans influencing Christianity? I think we named a bunch of them.
Well, in my opinion, the story of the holy women coming to the tomb of Jesus with all the unguents and spices to preserve the body and finding it empty. And then depending on which gospel, Jesus greets them alive, like in John and Matthew. I think this is impossible to prove. I admit that. I think originally, before things were reshuffled, remember how in, I think, what is it, chapter 14 of Mark, an unnamed woman, presumably it's Mary Magdalene, but the name's not there. She anoints Jesus, and some present say, what a waste. Isn't it our practice to sell goods like this and give the money to the poor? And Jesus says, get off her back. She's doing a special thing for me. She's kept it for the day of my burial. What? Well, my guess is that immediately preceded the crucifixion. Well, it practically does here. I mean, you have the trial narrative between the two, but that the women do bring the anointing materials on Easter morning and find the body of Jesus and do anoint him, whereupon he rises from the dead. And the male disciples would have been there saying, you're wasting your time and you're wasting this money. And to their great surprise, he rises from the dead. And I think this is the way it originally read, because it's a parallel that way to Isis and Nephthys approaching the slain body of Osiris, anointing it, which raises him from the dead. It seems to me that that's that is a major pagan influence. Now, admittedly, it's speculative. We don't have a time machine, but I think that it's too much of a coincidence, the association of these elements. So I'd say that is a major pagan.
Well, also you pointed out something about the women weeping over the death of Jesus, and sometimes it's two, depending on what gospel it is. There's two women at the tomb, Mary and Martha, or something, some other description of Salome, or whatever it is. But the point is, you get that is a very common motif in myths about Osiris, Adonis, and Attis. Yeah. So you have the women, whether it's Venus, Bacchus, or Aphrodite, weeping over the dead Adonis, and then Persephone also weeping over Adonis. Two women. You have two goddesses mourning over Adonis, and then you have in the Osiris, you have her sister Nephthys and Isis. Isis and Nephthys are weeping over the mutilated body of Osiris. They're trying to put it back together, and it's two women, and their mourning is magic. And by the way, this goes back to ancient Babylonian rites, where Ishtar mourns over Dumuzi. She beats her breast and cries, and this motif of the women mourning is what is like, to me, and the way I exegete that is they're saying that if you have women mourning over you at your death, you're immortal. Like you are going to be remembered for who you are, because you were so great in your lifetime that when you died, people were crying over you. And it's like I think it says something about the culture of people who bury their loved ones, and they see good people being buried, and they're seeing women crying, and then they see bad people being buried, and there's no one crying. So then people are putting together, this is divine. For someone to die and have women mourning over them is a divine thing. That's what that's how I take it.
Plutarch, I believe, tells us about what is it, Cleomenes, or it was a radical king of Sparta who was kicked out of office because of his plans for land reform, and he was raising hell all over the Eastern Mediterranean, and they finally killed him. And one of the soldiers poked the body with a sword to make sure he was dead, kind of like in John 19, and they left the body on the cross, and I think a snake wrapped itself around the head of the crucified man to keep the birds of prey from pecking at it. And the women mourners there said, this guy must have been a son of the gods. I mean, there again, you've got a lot of the same elements. I don't think that's a coincidence. Or how about this in Acts 17 at the Areopagus? What is it that they say Paul did? He was, like Socrates, advocating the worship of new gods, Jesus and Anastasis, the resurrection goddess.
You don't even know. you don't even know how true this is, because guess what's under the Areopagus? If you walked out, so the Areopagus is up on a hill. Guess what happens when you walk down on the hill? That's Socrates' prison.
Oh,
Socrates' jail is right there.
wow! What do you know?
And then another thing that happens in that same passage is what happens in the Areopagus is that Ares was on trial and he gets acquitted. Paul goes on trial and gets acquitted. So Paul is not only imitating Socrates, he's also imitating Ares at the Areopagus. Now you wouldn't. So these Bible scholars don't study these myths. But if this goes right past them, they have no idea. What's going on.
Yeah, I never knew that. Wow.
Yeah, it's right there. The same day I was at the Areopagus, I was 5 minutes away from 5-minute walk from Socrates' prison. It's right there, same general area. Yeah, I have the footage too.
Wow.
But yeah, that was a great point. I didn't think I'd bring that one up. But thank you for that super chat, Jane. Oh, by the way, did I cut you off? I think I cut you off. Were you saying something further about the Areopagus?
No.
Okay, I do that. I get excited. Sorry about that.
No.
Myth Vision Podcast, Dr. Bob. If you could debate Dr. Ehrman again with more cross-examination time, what would you press him on? Highlight your issues with this take. Great question.
Well, for one thing, I would point out the circularity of his reasoning when he says that there wouldn't have been enough time from the supposed death date of Jesus for these myths to form, when the whole point is, was there a death of Jesus? What was there? I mean, the bottom falls out of the whole thing if there wasn't a Jesus. He's simply assuming that there was and that he was a datable figure. Or we have Peter's testimony about Jesus. He was his best friend and knew all about him. You mean you're assuming there was a Jesus whose friend was Peter, when that is exactly the point at issue. He says, well, we've got Q and these other pre-gospel sources. Hey, wait a minute. We don't know that. Those are simply heuristic models for trying to figure out how the different sources of the gospels were combined. You can't use them as settled evidence for something else. I would say that I would reiterate to him that he says that, yeah, there are similarities between the Old Testament stories and the stories about Jesus, but that it's just, that doesn't mean the stuff didn't happen. It just was sort of made to look a little more like the Elijah stories and so on. And my objection was, if you take away the debt to First Kings, etc., you got nothing left. The whole story is looks like it was derived from there. And he said, "Oh well, no, I'm not saying that." But in fact, he was in the book. I was quoting him accurately when he said that there were no ancient novels in which the hero was crucified, the woman was buried alive accidentally and rescued by tomb robbers. He says, there were no such novels. Yes, there were. I can give you the editor's name and the title of the collection where you can read them for yourself. Or that mythicists are saying that all the passages that seem to refer to stuff like Paul having met the brother of Jesus, that when mythicists say, well, these are interpolations, they're only saying it because they have to get rid of the evidence. But in fact, every one of these, and I went through all of them, was suggested by a non-mythicist. And so on and so on and so on. He just didn't answer any of this stuff. He just laughed it off. He was unaware that some people thought that Paul didn't write Galatians. He literally was laughing at that one and said Rudolf Steck, one of Karl Barth's professors, believed that.
A lot of people.
And he just didn't know what he was talking about.
That's one thing about Barth and some other mainstream scholars that remind me of Barth, is they have this impression that the scholarly consensus is just the people they run with and the circles they agree with. And the thing about Bible scholars, there's so many of them. There's so many, like you go all the way to the fundamentalist scholars that believe in like the Noah's Ark is in Armenia. all the way down to the minimalists of the Copenhagen Society, Copenhagen seminar, who think like, no, the Bible's Hellenistic and Jesus probably barely even existed, that type of stuff. And in between, there's so many groups and circles, and there's different journals, different hosting events, and different people doing different things. They forget that there's other like areas of scholarship that don't agree with everything they're saying, and they have this impression that what they perceive to be the scholarly consensus is true, even though there's a lot of times there's a lot of opposition to those ideas.
And we can see why that is. Peter Berger talks about that you have professional guilds who, to maintain their position, make it impossible for anybody that dissents from sharing their accreditation. So you're going to be called kook. In the same way, Barth flat out admitted that if anybody tried to apply for a job at UNC who was a mythicist, they dismissed him out of hand. That's exactly what Berger is talking about. And it's just, this is why I suggested that we have a kind of a new Jesus seminar thing, where you, in each meeting, you would have a paper given by let's say a mainstream critic, and rejoinders or responses, whatever, by an evangelical apologist and a radical critic, and then a paper by the radical critic, the mythicist, etc., and the Bart Ehrman types and the fundamentalists responding to that, and so on, to have all three of them spotlighted. And I would love to participate in that. But I don't think anybody's going to do it.
Yeah. And this guy, Bart, man, he gets all this. He's like this to people online. It seems they think this is like the leading academic of our time when it comes to like the Bible or even just like anything in history. It seems like he gets, but Bart Ehrman says but it's like, this is someone who gets a lot of things horribly wrong on so many fronts. I talk about this on my channel a lot. Like I've read blogs by Bart where he's confusing Demetrius with Diogenes, and then it's not just a typo because later in the article he does it again, and then it's like come on, you got to know stuff like that. And then recently he was on Danny Jones, and he's talking about Semiticisms, which I understand that that's a thing that happens in the Septuagint. There's certain things that are written in Hebrew that get transliterated into Greek. They don't exist anywhere else in Greek. They only exist in Hebrew. That's a strong argument for why the Hebrew came first. But then he uses an example. He gives an example of the Holy Spirit, and he says he didn't really. I didn't, the clip that I saw, I didn't see him finish what he was saying, but he made the claim that Holy Spirit, which is like ruach in Hakadash in Hebrew, and then pneuma or pneuma in Greek. And I think he was trying to say like, oh, this is a Semiticism. But the thing as I pointed out earlier, pneuma is already a concept in Greek pre-Socratic thought way before the Bible gets translated. So that's not a Semiticism. I don't know what he meant by that. I don't know if he just like made a mistake there, but I thought that was a bad idea. Anyways, but yeah, I agree with you on that. I think that would be interesting.
I must say, though, I don't want to vilify him. He has done a lot of excellent work. His book, The Orthodox Corruption of Scripture, is terrific. His book, Jesus Before the Gospels, about the oral tradition hypothesis, that's a great one. The forgery book. He's done a lot of great stuff, no question. It's just that in this area, he's ignoring some important things.
Well, no, and I agree with everything you just said. He's a great scholar. He deserves credit. He's a textual criticism genius, whatever. I don't even care. I'll give him all that credit. But people need to settle down about citing Bart for every opinion about the Bible. Yeah. He's just one guy. He's not an all-knowing, not the greatest scholar ever, whatever. So that's why I criticize him. I criticize him to balance out I'm trying to balance out the discourse a little bit. Try to give people to say, look, he's not. This guy's kind of flawed, like all of us. Like we're all flawed,
Yeah, I
Anyways,
don't want to have heroes and villains in this stuff.
sure.
There aren't any bad guys. Like William Lane Craig, I tend to discount almost everything he says, but that's because I'm addressing the particular arguments. But I don't think, I'm not going to say, oh, the guy's a con man, or I'm no mind reader. How can I know that? He's a very learned man. I'm not, he's a real scholar. His breadth of knowledge is great. I just happen to think he's wrong on a whole bunch of stuff, as he does with me. That's
Yeah.
the way it goes in the scholarly guild. You don't hate the people that disagree with you.
Yeah. Greek informant in the house. Thank you for the super chat. Dr. Bob, would you go as far as to say that Christianity is a Hellenistic religion?
I think the Ebionite type of Christianity was probably not, though it was a kind of Gnosticism in its own right. But it's died on the vine. Basically, it lasted a few centuries. But any type of Christianity today, I think, is essentially Hellenistic in conceptuality and in many of the stories and the way doctrines are understood, like the debate between Athanasius and Arius had to do with the mechanics of salvation. Is salvation divinization, where we're absorbed into the energies of God? All of that stuff is definitely Hellenistic, and of course that's no slap against it. So yeah, I think it is. Not that that's a criticism.
Yeah, and I would even go farther than what you just said. It's 100% Hellenistic, and because even the Ebionites are Hellenistic in the sense that Judaism itself, when in its final form, or I shouldn't say final form, like the form where things become clear that it's where we have as a Judaism. For example, hearkening to Jonathan Adler definition of Judaism. Judaism is the religion that was enforced by the Maccabees in the 160s, where there was it was like there was a law code, there was a text, there was a priesthood, there was a Bible, all that stuff. Things that we all recognize as Judaism starts pretty much then, which is in the Hellenistic century. Period. Yeah, we're talking second century BC. This is in the Hellenistic period. They're adopting Hellenistic tenets. Platonism is one of them, Pythagoreanism, things like that. I think by the time we get to the Essene or the Ebionites, I think they're already Hellenistic in their own right. They're just not going along with the other trends of Roman era Christianity. But then like even if we go back to the Maccabean period, where everyone thinks there was like this huge divide between what the Jews were doing and the Greeks around them, even the Maccabees, who were resisting the Seleucids, were still naming their children with Greek names like Jason, and they're still adopting Greek culture to a certain extent. And then the high priest, I pulled him up, Jason. This high priest, his name was Jesus, by the way. I don't know if it says it in here. He changed his name to Jason to be more Hellenized. He was the high priest. Now, the Maccabee books villainize this guy and say he was a Hellenizer and he was bad, and his brother Onias was the good one, the fallen Messiah. But what does that tell us historically? Forget about Maccabees and what Maccabees says. It's a biased book. Look at the evidence on the ground. There's a high priest who becomes high priest historically, we know this, named Jason, who's adopting Hellenistic ideals and bringing them into Judaism. This is right here. Antiochus by the Romans. Jason was displaced by Menelaus, another Hellenizing Jew. So even after Jason, Menelaus comes along and becomes the high priest. And there's this whole thing of like Hellenism is something that the Jews are taking seriously. Even if they're rejecting it, it's still going back and forth like a tug of war. And like as Jonathan Adler points out, they're minting coins with Athena on them and Zeus on them in Israel. So this idea, Hellenist, is it Hellenistic? I think, yeah, it's Hellenistic, especially later Christians who are already like part of this whole world of the Hellenistic period. So
Yeah, you even have stuff like the synagogue of Dura Europa, that
yeah,
from what, the second or third century, when you would expect Judaism to be even more inward looking and attempting to be hermetically sealed off from the pagans. And there's a mosaic on the floor showing Hercules in a chariot driving through the wheel of the zodiac.
yeah.
Boy.
Yeah, I saw that, and that's not even just in Dura Europus. That's in Judea, in
Hmm.
in Sepphoris, where I just talked about, which is Nazareth, the Nazareth region. There is a synagogue there with a zodiac with Helios in it.
Oh
Helios.
boy.
So this
Wow.
is like, yeah, this is just part of their culture. Like they're
Mm,
not. We should not look at them as something separate from the Mediterranean world. They
mm,
are the Judeans and the Israelites, whatever you want, whichever period we're looking at, are part of the same Mediterranean world as Egypt, as Carthage, as Italy and Spain and Greece and Asia Minor and Syria. They're all part of that world. And so why should we separate one because their book defines it that way, that they define themselves that way? Should we just take their book as the axiom? Now we're just dealing in their theology. You know what I mean?
mhm,
Are we being critical, or are we doing theology?
mhm.
So I
Look
don't know.
at the way Hercules is still a superhero in modern America, in movies and comic books and all
Yes.
that. An outsider would think, "Oh, you guys are polytheists. You still worship the Greek god Hercules, Heracles?"
Yeah.
No, of course not. There was no Hercules, but boy, it's like Superman. Uh, it has a place in culture, and you have to know something about the culture to see what the place is.
Yeah, and Josephus in Antiquities, he mentions, I think I can pull it up right now. He mentions that there's a Hercules being worshipped in I think Phoenicia or in the north, like Galilee or something like that. And he's probably talking about Melkart. He doesn't say Melkart. He uses the Greek Heracles, right?
Hmm.
But he says that this particular Heracles is honored with specific rituals about his death and return from life,
Mm.
and it uses the Greek word, not I think it's exeris or something. It doesn't use Anastasius, this lift up. It uses like another word that the New
Yeah.
Testament uses in Matthew. I can look it up. Word for
Mm.
resurrection in Greek. I know it's at the tip of my tongue. It starts with an E. It's
Yeah.
not the
Yeah.
Anastasius. Um, and I forgot it. It didn't come up right away in New Testament. Greek
I
word
know
for
what you mean.
resurrection.
I can't quite think of it either.
Yeah, it's on the top of my head. I can't find it right now. I'll look it up as you're doing the next super chat. But I was gonna say, Josephus uses the exact same word for Heracles Melkart in Josephus. I'm gonna pull it up after you're reading this next super chat, so I can put my money where my mouth is. I know for a fact it's there because I did it. I did a video on this and I did the research and I had the sources. It's a matter of me finding it. But while I'm looking that up, Dr. Bob Ligma FPV says, I find it suspicious that the first two mentions of Paul, Clement/Luke, are from almost the exact same period, like 40 years after Paul died. Thoughts?
Well, for one thing, if there was a Paul, and as you know, says there was not, and she has an interesting argument. I am of the opinion that Paul, the historical Paul, was Simon Magus, as attested in Josephus, oddly enough. But even if you take the biblical Paul, it doesn't say when he died. And the notion that he was put to death by Nero is part and parcel of the apocryphal Acts of Paul, which is utterly legendary. And and I think the reference in First Clement, which is actually gratuitously attributed to Clement, there's no name on it. This refers to Paul and Peter being put to death out of jealousy which seems to me best understood as a reference to, again, the apocryphal Acts of the Apostles, because there are 5 major ones from the 2nd century: Peter, Paul, Thomas, Andrew, and John. And in all of them, the apostle is finally martyred because jealous husbands are complaining to the authorities that these guys are charlatan, gigolo homewreckers because they're preaching the Encretite gospel. Celibacy is required for salvation, so women stop sleeping with your husbands. And so the estranged husbands get their buddies, the king or governor, to arrest the apostle and put him to death. It seems to me, if that's what Clement, quote unquote, means, then you're just dealing with legend. We have no idea when Paul would have died. Plus, there's no telling whether. Well, Luke certainly doesn't say. I mean, the end of the Gospel of Luke is Paul is last seen preaching to Jews in his when he's under house arrest in Rome. Traditionally, people thought that he then was let go. He was acquitted and went to Spain and preached there, but then was arrested again at some unknown date. So, I mean, even Orthodox tradition, for what it's worth, doesn't pretend to know when Paul was killed or how he died. And the notion that it was in 60 or something like that is simply a function of trying to historicize Paul, to hypothesize when, given this cloud of dubious, quote, information, if you can extract some likely death date. So it's really impossible to say.
Yeah, well said. I always want to put my money where my mouth is. I don't like to say things. I like to show people. So thank you for that super chat. I'll come back to you in a second. Let me just put this aside. So, okay, this was the word we were both thinking of. It was on the tip of our tongue. I said it started with an E. I said, what did I say? Ahersis? That was close. Agersis.
Yeah.
I knew it was something like that. Okay, anyways, it's used in Matthew. It literally means resurrection. It literally says metaten egersen. Metaten ergersen. To Aestilton. So after his resurrection, they entered. Okay? Remember that. This is the word they use for resurrection. It's not always anastasis. Anastasis means to stand up, literally.
Yeah.
But it's used for resurrection more often than this word is. This is a more rare word, but it literally means resurrection in every single translation of Matthew. Resurrection, resurrection, resurrection. Now, with that being said, keep that in the top of your tongue, on the tip of your, keep that in the front of your brain for a second, because this is what Josephus says about Heracles. He says, thus Menander, as they report, you can look this up for yourself. Go to look at the Greek too. Check the Greek out. Antiquities 853 refers to the festival of the resurrection of the Tyrian god Heracles. It uses the exact same word, egersis. Egersis. So Josephus talks about, and by the way, if you pull up the translation, the common translation of that everyone uses, by William Whiston. No offense, William Whiston, you're outdated, because he uses reawakening. He uses reawakening, but like that's cheap. That's a cheap shot. If we're gonna use resurrection from Matthew, then why weren't we using resurrection for Heracles? It's literally a resurrection. So same word, and it's a festival of the resurrection. And by the way, I found an article on this from a scholar of Phoenician religion. She said this happens in the springtime. So now I got to put my money where my mouth is again. I'll pull that one up. Hold on one second. While I pull that one up, Matthew Lambert in the house. Thank you for the super chat. Dr. Price, what do you think, if at all, we could find that would be a smoking gun for mythicism? Great question.
Well, I think you could have a smoking gun to refute mythicism if you found some ancient papyrus letter, of which there are many surviving, where someone just happens to mention, for instance, that they saw the famous Jesus speaking to the crowds on a recent visit to Jerusalem, and not an attempt to glorify Jesus or to say, oh, you got to believe in Jesus and all that, but just a reference to having seen a famous person. To me, that would be hard to explain as some kind of fiction. And I would say, okay, I'll grant that there must have been a wise man. No evidence is no evidence. We don't have anything like that now. And given that the lack of it is not proof that there was no historical Jesus. But if we did have that, I think that would tip the scales. And maybe such a thing will be discovered. Who knows?
Thank you for that. I appreciate that. That's a good point. Now, remember, I always say I always put my money where my mouth is. Whenever I make a claim about something in the sources, I want to make sure everyone knows that I'm not just saying that out of my ass. So this is an article from Robin Jensen and Melkart and Hercules, a study of ancient gods and their influence. Now, check this out. They point out that exact, so the same thing that Josephus was talking about, where that resurrection gets, this is what she writes. The Phoenicians were no different than many other cultures. They needed a god whom they could properly idolize. Melkart fulfilled this need in several roles. He was known as the mighty hunter and played the central role in the Phoenician spring festival, during which he died and was resurrected. Come on, man. Really? The same time of the year? Really? Same place, same area? Right there. Phoenicia's right next to Galilee. You know what I mean? You got a god that dies in the spring and resurrects. And they have a festival for him in that time period. So I'm just pointing out things that are true. You can get mad at me all you want and say I'm connecting dots that shouldn't be connected. But,
well, this God is mentioned in the Bible because this was the Baal that Jezebel was promoting.
Yeah.
Baal, Melkart, Hercules.
Yeah. So, by the way, that article is from Studia Antiqua. It's a pretty good journal. It's a pretty high level journal. Oh, and that's not that. I just pulled that one up because I knew there was journals on this subject. There's a bunch of people talking about this spring festival. It's not just this one. I didn't just find one article that agrees with me. This is well established that the Melkart festival was in the springtime, and it makes sense.
Oh yeah,
it makes sense because the spring is the resurrection of life of the year. So it's like what. This is another thing about mythicism that we need to address. You have a god. Oh, so let me actually. I just thought of something. I don't know why I haven't brought this up yet. Let me go back to that super chat. Where was it? This one. Oh wait, this one. Smoking gun for mythicism. So, there's a book right here by Robert Turkin. Everyone needs to know this. Everyone needs to know this. There's 1,400 people watching this right now. Couldn't be a better time for me to bring this up. There's a book by Robert Turkin called The Cults of the Roman Empire. Robert Turkin, Cults of the Roman Empire. And in the first chapter of this book, he talks about the god Attis. And he says, by the way, this is not just some random Joe Schmo. This is this is like one of the great classical archaeologists of our time. One of the greats. This is Blackwell Publishing. This is top of the line, peer review, all this stuff. This is one of the definitive books about Cults of the Roman Empire. This is like the go-to. You have to have this if you're serious. He says that the festival known as Hilaria, if I can pull it up for a second, festival known as Hilaria, which was celebrated by the Romans, and it was Hilaros means cheerful, merry, or rejoicing. And apparently during this festival, they bring out an image of the dead god Attis, and they bury him on a pine tree. So it's like a crucified.
Yep.
He's attached to a tree. By the way, the word for tree in Hebrew is the same word for wood. So he's attached to wood or tree, and he's buried in the ground. And after 3 days of mourning, the day of joy. So the second, it's buried on the 22nd, and then they mourn, and then they mourn, and then they rejoice on the third day, celebrating the resurrection of Addis, as opposed to the mournful tone of the previous days. He gets buried on the 22nd, and he resurrects on the 25th. Okay. The reason why I brought that up is because according to this book right here, this festival started by Claudius. This didn't happen after the Gospels were written. According to Robert Turkin, like as I'm saying, I'm appealing to Robert Turkin right now. According to Robert Turkin, this festival was instituted by Claudius, and then he gives us a bunch of evidence of the Claudius's family being part of the Attian dynasty that goes back to Phrygia, and it was there they wanted to bring these rites into Rome. They're a big Attis family, and then he points to primary sources like John the Lydian, which is, I know this is a late source, 5th century, I think it is. John the Lydian says that he also says that this festival started under Claudius. And then we also have the evidence that during the reign of Marcus Aurelius added a day to the festival. So if the festival didn't exist, how is he adding days to the festival? Marcus Aurelius is middle of the 2nd century, right? So so we have evidence that there's a festival in Rome, contemporary or maybe right before the Gospels, with a guy that dies and resurrects 3 days later. So I brought that up to say, when we're looking at historicity, off the bat, at the very least, if the guy did exist, we should still question if he got crucified during the spring equinox season. That is a weird coincidence. People will say, we know he went down to Jerusalem during the Passover because the Bible says so. He was crucified under Pilate. These are the things that historicists cling to. The things that no matter what you say about his life, these things are true. That he existed, he was born in Nazareth, he died in Jerusalem during the Passover. But wait a minute. He goes and dies at the same time when the Passover lamb is slaughtered and all these other gods are dying and resurrected, like Melkart and Hercules and Attis and Adonis, and they have all their spring festivals going on at this time of gods that die and resurrect. And you don't think that's a coincidence that we should be examining here? So if he did exist, at the very least, we should still question, did this happen in the springtime, or are they pushing him and are they putting him in the springtime to sort of align with this cosmic seasonal thing that all the other people are going with? So,
There's I can't remember the title of the author. I got it written down somewhere, but this is a book about the survivals of ancient Greek religion. And this scholar was researching it and went to Greece and was there for a passion play on Good Friday, and they had a villager made up as Jesus, and had some kind of staged crucifixion thing, and then they put him on a stretcher or something and put him inside a makeshift tomb, and they're like reenactors of Good Friday. And this guy's standing in the crowd, and next to him is a little old lady who is weeping hysterically. And he turns to her and says, "Ma'am, what's wrong?" And she says, "If Jesus doesn't rise on Sunday, we'll have no crops this year." And nobody had to tell this lady about comparative religion parallels. Or anything. She never heard of any of this scholarship, but she knew what was going on.
Yeah, and this is how they viewed. This is what the Adonis and Attis and Tammuz and Bacchus. These are agricultural deities, and the critics of mythicists are correct to point out those are agricultural. But here's the thing, though: as Platonism progresses and takes over, the idea of agricultural myths become less relevant. Now we're looking for spiritual. We're looking for higher ideals, the realm of ideas, the noetic realm, the pleroma, all that stuff. All of a sudden, we're moving away from the agricultural and going towards the more idealistic, which is rather resurrection of the soul, right? Now, the reason why I brought that up is because Jesus himself, as he's giving parables, he's giving agricultural themes, talking about the sheaf will separate the wheat from the chaff. That is an Eleusinian. I found this out when I went to Eleusis, that the separation of the wheat and the chaff was a metaphor in the Eleusinian mysteries of initiates. The ones who are separated from the chaff are the new initiates. The rest are scattered abroad. So he's using agricultural, Dionysian, death and resurrection of agricultural themes, Persephone and Dionysus, in his parables. He's talking about how seeds were scattered around and Satan came and choked some of them. Some of them grew and became vines. Some of them grew into big flowers. That is agricultural. He's also talking about there was a farmer and he did this, and all of a sudden he's using agricultural parables. So even though Jesus himself and his resurrection might not be agricultural as like the theme, there's still that agricultural layer that's present in the Gospels. So I don't think you have to separate Jesus from the agricultural myths 100%. I think there's still a little bit.
So the agricultural deities were believed to have lived on Earth at one point.
Yes, exactly.
That's like mythicists don't claim that Jesus was originally understood as a fable or an allegory. The idea was the notion came about, however the other ones did, that there was a god whose death caused or coincided with the death of vegetation, and whose resurrection sparked off the resurrection of nature, like the divine king myths too. That was an earlier version of the same thing.
Yeah,
and they believed in those gods. They had existed, they thought.
Oh, I just realized I missed the super chat. I'll go back to this in a second. Murder. I'll go back to this. Makunda. Sorry about that. But what you just said is true. But check this out. I just pulled up a random list. I just wanted to see a list of the parables, just so we can look at them and just on the skim the surface. Look what we got here. Purpose of the parables. We have the sower, agricultural. The weeds, agricultural. The leaven, agricultural. Hidden treasure, pearl of great value. The net. Okay, that's more of like a fisherman. There's something about that too. The lost sheep. All right, now we're getting into hermetic and Orphic type of stuff with the shepherd, like Hermes and Orpheus, right? But like you can see the agricultural layers, the barren fig tree. So you see what I'm saying? You have a bunch of parables that are using agricultural themes to explain the kingdom of heaven. That is exactly what the pagans were doing in their mythologies. They were using agricultural themes to explain the divine.
What else did you have on hand to use?
Exactly. What else? Exactly. That's what I'm saying. So like, yeah, this idea that those are agricultural, so we'll put those in one box, and Jesus is different. I think needs to be attacked. I think that's a dumb idea. Anyways, let's see. Let me see this. Or somehow I messed up this order. But anyways, Mero Media in the house. Subscribe if you aren't subscribed. You can find a video of me being interviewed on this channel. So if anyone's watching this right now and hasn't heard of Mero Media, hit that subscribe button. If the early Jews and Christians understood the mythic nature of the stories, why and when did that change? First for the Jews and then the Christians?
I don't think they did understand it as mythic. The idea of, Plato already is saying there's good and bad myths, and one ought to be promoted, the other suppressed, and all that. But I think both Cross and Carrier say that the early Christians weren't as stupid as modern people and didn't take this stuff literally. I see no reason to believe that. It seems to me that from the beginning, we have to assume they believed the stuff had really happened. I mean, I don't think Marcion did, who I agree with Vincent, that he was probably the one that adapted the Old Testament stories to Jesus stories. So he must have known, but I don't think the average Christian or Jew thought it was all imaginary or whatever. Even Philo, he allegorized all the Old Testament stories, but I don't think he thought they didn't happen. He just thought that there was more to them. Like
Yeah,
Paul says,
Philo would famously open up his chapters with, if we go beyond the story about David, for example, and we look at the more metaphorical truth behind this, like he doesn't say, yeah, he's going beyond the surface level, and he's trying to look for more Platonic truths inside the Jewish myths.
like Paul says, these things were written for our edification. That doesn't mean they didn't happen. I mean, we think they didn't, but I don't think they did.
Yeah. He even says, like if you go to, let's see, which one is it again? Allegorical interpretations. That's what he calls it. And the whole entire thing of it's in Philo, and the whole entire thing is just about like going through the Bible and going through the allegories behind it all. Like it's very, very proto-Christian in that sense. Like he just like basically is going through page by or scripture by scripture and explaining the allegorical interpretations of them. That's what Philo does. That's what he's known for. And look, everyone always says Philo's a Jew first and then Platonist second. I don't know about that sometimes. When you read Philo, he's pretty Platonic. He's very dedicated to Plato. And he even talks good about Greek gods. He talks about Bacchus giving the gifts to humanity of vintage and how great that was, how great Hermes is, the great messenger of the gods, Hermes and his swift feet. He uses that type of imagery in his writing when he's explaining these concepts. So I don't know if he's a Jew first and a Platonist second. I just think he's a Platonist. And he's just Jewish. It just happens to be both. I don't think there's one or the other,
Well, there's one clue that he had literalists on the one hand and on the other, people that agreed with him about the allegorical meaning, but they said, now that we know what it really means, we don't have to actually keep all those laws literally anymore. And Philo said, oh, wait just a minute. Yes, you do. And the other guys were much like the Ismaili Shiites later on, who said, we understand the mystical meaning, so to hell with the literalism. It was just, baby steps and nursery rhymes to get to the point.
Yeah, I agree. But thanks for that super chat. That's a good question. Let's see. We got a couple more. John Wild says, Jink, thank you for the 20, by the way. Appreciate that. Now, if only we could get Adam Green from No More News into this discussion. Actually, I think Adam Green should have you on his channel, maybe. I don't know. I think Adam Green is a mythicist, and he's really dedicated to this. And I think you two, do you know who that is or no?
I was on with, I think, an Adam Green once.
Maybe you have.
Yeah. Sort of though I didn't know at the time. I hesitate to say this because I may have the wrong guy, but I'm pretty sure that was the name. This guy was an anti-Semite, and it didn't come up while we were. I mean, I began to get a little suspicious.
No, he's not. The reason why he gets called that, I talked to him before about this. I actually think he was too. And then he's like, no, I'm not, dude. Find me where I'm at being anti-Semitic. And I was like, I don't know, dude. I just heard you are. He's like, no, everything I pointed out is about religious fundamentalist Judaism. He's like, it just happens to be that I talk about it so much that label just came to me. And he's got a point.
Guy said to me, if this was the same man, that he thought Jews cooked up Christianity to corrupt or defeat the Gentiles or enslave them.
Yeah, he might have that little bit of that going on. Yeah.
If he did, then I once I found that out, I said, well, that's good luck to you, but I'm not.
In a way, he's not wrong, because Christianity is from Jewish people who are trying to evangelize. They're trying to win. They're trying to promote their. I don't know that necessarily means they're evil because they're doing that, or like they. I don't know if there's something that's anti-Semitic about saying that, but whatever. I don't want to get into this discussion right now. But yeah. Anyways, that's what they wrote. Thank you for the super chat. Praveen Paul says, "What does Dr. Bob think about Nina Livesey's argument that the letters of Paul are fabricated in the 2nd century?"
Well, I already was a big fan of Dutch radicalism from the 19th and early 20th century with W.C. van Manen, Samuel Neighbor, and various other ones, Rudolf Steck, et cetera, who already believed that that none of the Pauline epistles were written by him, any more than modern critical scholars think any of the truckload of stuff with Peter's name on them is by Peter. The Acts of Peter, the Gospel of Peter, the Apocalypse of Peter, the preachings of Peter, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th epistles of Peter, only 2 of which are in the canon. Nobody thinks for a second, no critical scholar, that Peter wrote this. It was just that by that time he was a big name. So if you wanted somebody to read it, you would say that, well, it's not just me. I'm just a schmuck. Who cares what I think? But if Peter said this, well, if that's the case, and critical scholars already think 6 out of the 13 with Paul's name on them are not authentic. Why should it be out of the question to entertain the possibility that none of them are authentic? And there are pretty good reasons. You can't prove this, but I think she, especially by invoking the analogy of Seneca's moral epistles, that really, I think, clinches it. So I think she's right, personally. I have 2 sets of commentary on the Pauline epistles, one of them in my book, The Amazing Colossal Apostle, and the other in volume 3, the epistles and Revelation, the volumes of my series, Holy Fable. And in the one, I say I embrace the Dutch radical hypothesis. Paul wrote none of them. And let's see what sense it would make if we read them through that prism. But in the other one, I say, I don't want to just repeat myself. Let's play fair and adopt, for the sake of argument, the standard critical view that the lucky 7 epistles are by Paul. What would they tell us then? And so I say you can compare the 2 if you want, because both of them are viable paradigms to interpret. But I tend to, so I think I was very fair, and both of them are productive. Both shed different light, though I do really prefer the Dutch radical and Nina Livesey approach that Paul wrote none of them.
Yeah, I think whatever Livesey's work, at the very least, even if I'm not sold on everything she says, needs to be taken seriously and put on the table, and people need to address it like as if it's like she could be correct.
Oh,
like
yeah,
there's a lot of hand waving going on. People are calling her crazy and radical for this is just nonsense. Of course he existed. Well, why don't you read her? She points out the second sophistic movement and how Paul is associated with that. That's a really strong point. I don't even think I can think of anything to refute that. It's like Saint Dionysius, the pseudo Dionysius, the Areopagite from the 5th century. They're writing this character into the 1st century in a very anachronistic way, but he's a Neoplatonist. Obviously, if you read him, he's completely Neoplatonic. He's got all these doctrines of theosis and the mystical triads and all this stuff, which is from way later, 4th and 3rd century philosophy. So he has to be way beyond the 3rd century. Turns out he's 5th century. But anyways, the reason why I bring him up is Nina makes a point about Paul being aligned with second sophistic movement, which is a 2nd century movement. And what, he's in the 1st century? But did he start this movement? I don't think so. So she makes a really good point that his philosophy lines up with the 2nd sophistic writers.
Does anybody think that there's an actual demon named Screwtape who collected his letters and had C.S. Lewis publish them for him. I mean, that's a literary genre like Platonic dialogue.
Yes.
Plato wasn't actually transcribing things that Socrates said. He, at least in
No.
the later dialogues, he's just saying, here's what I think Socrates, based on what we know of him, would have said.
Yeah.
But he wasn't trying to fool anybody.
Yeah.
It's like, and this is the same thing.
And the idea of epistles in that time period were being written as fiction. There was fiction epistles all going. I have a whole book about this.
The Epistle of Aristeas, for one.
That's another. Yeah, there's a whole genre of fake epistles that are written for people to read and get some sort of learning from them. Paul might be one of these. He might be part of this genre.
Yeah.
And the idea that this is out of the question, to me, that's crazy. Why is it out of the question? We should be dealing with this as a possibility.
Well, the reason people are like Darrell Dowdy, a professor of mine, he and I were members of the Paul Seminar of the West Star Institute. And we did a couple of papers adopting the Dutch radical view, why Van Manen and others said what they did, and so on and so on. We practically, literally got laughed out of the thing. I said, well, it's obvious to me that the Jesus Seminar, which was the main thing that group did, they need Jesus to be able, even though they're all as liberal as the day is long, they still need Jesus as their authority. But I'm sorry, no, they don't need Jesus so much. As Protestants, Paul matters more than Jesus.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
I'm sorry. So you can say, oh, we don't know if Jesus said any of this stuff, but Paul, wait just a minute now.
That's very true.
It's just implicit theological bias, it seems to me. But again, that doesn't matter. That's a genetic fallacy. We need to look at the arguments. But I think the arguments are pretty darn good.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you for that super chat. What's the next one? Oh, here we go. Jane Kamari, thank you for the super chat. Why the name Jesus if he's fake and not Emmanuel? Yeah, look, why name him Jesus and why not just give him the name Emmanuel and so you can get, that's a good point.
I wonder that. I've never heard a decent theory about that. Matthew himself creates the problem by saying that Jesus' birth was the fulfillment of Isaiah's prophecy and so on. Emmanuel, God is with us. But they don't name him that. What the hell?
Right. I always thought this was weird too.
Richard Carrier, to his credit, pointed out that, well, take a look at the end of the book where Jesus says, I will be with you till the end of the age. But I'm sorry, that
makes him God, too.
It doesn't really help. Because why do they not name him Emmanuel, which the prophecy says they're to do? I mean, the angel tells them to do. I really don't get that. I don't know what the answer to that is.
No, it's a good point. There is this is another thing. This is one of the feuds that me and Carrier had, was this with the Jesus thing, because in Philo, in the book called On the Change of Names, he does talk about the name Jesus. And he talks about this name being one of the greatest names, and it's one of the higher names. It's about salvation of the God, all this stuff. Now, for me personally, that would have been if there was already a Jesus worship happening in the early first century, that would have been a great time for Philo to be like, oh, by the way, there's this group of Jews that worship Jesus, and they're called the Essenes, and they live over here. So this to me is actually a smoking gun against Carriers.
Well, on the other hand,
I was going to say, on the other hand, go ahead. You talk. Go ahead. Jump in.
Doesn't he make Joshua of the Old Testament, Joshua, a cipher for the Logos and so on?
Yeah.
Because
he does
that
say,
might be a way of saying that he thought that the Joshua was the Logos. And in fact, Margaret Barker pointed out a very significant thing.
I don't think he says that, though. But go ahead. Go ahead. I don't think he says that Joshua is the Logos. You have to go to a different verse, and he makes a point about Logos being the heir of God. But he doesn't say that Joshua is the Logos. But go ahead.
Okay, I've got to check that out. I may be wrong.
Go ahead.
But Barker says that you ever notice that though Jesus is called frequently the Son of God, which Theos, the Greek counterpart to Elohim, but he's never once called the Son of the Kurios, the Lord, which was the substitute or one of them for Yahweh. And she says that's because the early Jewish Christians were polytheists, that deuteronomic monotheism had never completely caught on any more than the Vatican II documents did. And that so when Jesus is talking about his Father and praying to him, that's Yahweh speaking to El Elyon, his Father. And that early Christians, in effect, thought that Jesus' appearance on earth was an extended theophany, as when the angel of Yahweh appeared throughout the Old Testament. And so that's what they understood him to be, which will also explain Docetism, since they tended to think angels didn't have physical substance, couldn't eat, and all that. So if that's the case, you don't really have to say there was some special esoteric cult of Joshua. It's just that these early Jewish Christians thought of Jesus as the angel of Yahweh, and that's why his name is Yahweh is salvation.
That's another point too, is the name. So I'm going to get back to that, but I just want to address something real quick. So Godfrey, and I like this guy. I read his articles all the time. He points out that, Carrier talks about this idea of Jesus, and he points out this is one of the verses that me and Carrier bumped heads on, was this on the confusion of tongues, where he says, "Behold, a man whose name is the East, very noble appellation indeed, if you consider it as spoken of a man who is compounded of body and soul. But if you look upon it as applied to the incorporeal beings," very Platonist, by the way, "who in no respect differs from the divine image, you will then agree that the name of the East has been given to him with great felicity. The Father of the universe has caused him to spring up as his eldest son, whom in another passage he calls firstborn, thus imitating the ways of the Father." Now, in this particular passage, there's no link to Jesus or a Logos, but in other parts, as Carrier points out, and I'm just using Neil to guide me through this, in other parts of Carrier, Philo says, "If no one is worth to be called son of God, we shall labor earnestly to be adorned according to the firstborn Logos, the eldest of the angels, the ruling archangel of many names." And then so this idea that because he has many names, Jesus would have been one of them. But my rebuttal to that was, what then when he's talking about the name Jesus in the other book, that would have been a great time for him to say the name of the Logos. You know what I mean? So so to me, that just, it kind of falls apart. But I don't think there's nothing there. I think this is all interesting. Another problem I have with this is that, later on Jesus gets all these titles, but if Philo's living all the way up until what, 40 to 50 AD, right? Isn't that how long I think Philo lives from like 20 BC to like 50 AD or something. And if that's the case, I don't know when he wrote this particular, it might have been 30 or 40 AD, but we're almost getting to the point where we're only decades before the Gospels now. And if Philo doesn't know about a cult that are Christians yet, that are worshiping Jesus, I don't know if it exists. So that's my issue with that particular brand of mythicism. Does that make sense what I said?
Yeah, but it was a common thing, at least widespread, to say that some Old Testament figure, whether it was Moses, Enoch, Jacob, or others, were actually the lesser Yahweh and were enthroned in heaven at the right hand of God. And
I agree with this 100%, but I just don't know how were they calling it Jesus that back then yet? I don't think so.
Early Christians do. I mean, what they say about
right.
Jesus,
No, you're right. The Christians do.
It sounds like he's another one of those.
Sure. No, I agree with that point, that there was something happening in early Common Era, late 1st century BC, early 1st century CE. In that little area, there's something happening in Jewish circles about some sort of messianic figure some sort of angelic being, some sort of Metatron-like figure.
Mhm.
I agree with that. That's all getting cooked up. But what I think, what I would like to see is evidence that there is groups like that called that thing Jesus. Then it'd be game over. Mythicism wins. But to me, I'm yet to see any evidence of that being taking place. Unless you know
aren't
something.
you arbitrarily sort of sealing off the fact that in early Christian New Testament sources, Jesus is depicted as Metatron, essentially?
Yeah. No, that's why I've always maintained, at the very least, mythicism is correct, and that what we're getting in the Gospels is not history; it's myth. So mythicists are right about that. Then this aren't history. So whether it was a guy or not is almost beside the point. If there was a guy named Jesus, and then they're applying this Metatron theology of a fallen Messiah to a man that actually lived, mythicism's still right to a certain degree, because it's still mythology. Like I mentioned, the Alexander romance, it's still mythology. So I would just like to see, personally, before I go on the carrier bandwagon, which I used to be a part of, by the way, I would like to see evidence that those groups of people were worshiping the Jesus, as Carrier says. That's my issue with it. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Are you saying
I'm not denying
a non-Christian group that worshipped Jesus?
A Jewish group from the early first century that was worshiping a divine figure called Jesus,
but not the Christians.
Not the Christians.
Why would they not be Christians?
Because that's what Carrier says, is that there was a group of Jewish people who were before the Gospels, before everything, they were worshiping an angelic version of Jesus, and we have all this evidence for it. And I don't see it. Do you not get what I'm saying? So if there was let's say there's a group of Jews that worship Metatron in 1st century BC, are they Christians?
Well, those who in the 1st century there were people that thought, like Epiphanius and others, that Jesus did live in the 1st century BCE.
I know. Forget about all that. Let's just say if there was a group of Jews that worshipped a Messiah, let's not even say his name is Jesus, but they're worshiping a Messiah, and it's Metatron, and they're like, oh, Metatron and Yahweh, there's a dyad. Are those Christians? Do we call them Christians?
Well, if they describe such a figure and name him Jesus, and they're Jews,
no, I'm not saying that. They're not naming him Jesus yet. I'm not even saying that. I'm just saying, if we could find a group of Jews that were already sort of coming up with a theology where you have God and you have another figure, some sort of like Son of Man figure, does that necessarily make them Christians? I would say no. I say it makes them some sort of proto-Christian group that you can point to and say maybe this sort of influences Christians, but I don't think that's Christians yet. That's what I'm saying. Do you understand what I'm saying or not?
I'm not sure I do. I don't know why that, since early Christians did describe Jesus in Metatronic terms, why
when you say early Christians, when you say early Christians, what do you mean? 2nd century, late 1st century? Who are you talking about? Paul?
Yeah, I mean, they're the way they understand the ascended Jesus. I mean, there's like 10 New Testament quotes from Psalm 110, I think. Sit at my right hand and all that. That kind of sounds like Enoch in 3rd Enoch or various other ones.
Sure.
Ezekiel the Tragedian.
Yeah, I'm not saying that they're not applying all that to Jesus. In later Christian circles, people who thought that this Jesus existed, they're applying all this Metatron stuff to him. They're applying all the messianic stuff to him. I'm not saying that's not happening, but I'm saying if there was a group of people that were Jewish that had a theology where they worshiped some sort of like Son of Man figure, but his name wasn't Jesus, would we call that Christian? I think that's nonsense. That's what I'm saying. And so even if there was even if we found like Philo is like pointing to some sort of different kind of theology that's Platonic, and there's some sort of divine figure, which there is, by the way. If Philo does mention this, the Logos, all that stuff's already cooking up What I'm saying is all that's already cooking up in early and late Judaism before Christianity. But I think what I would love to see is evidence that those people actually called that thing Jesus before the Gospels and Paul. That's what I'm looking for. That matters, because if we're talking about Jesus pre-existing all the way back to the 1st century BC or something, you kind of have to show evidence for it, and you can't just point to Metatron. That's what I'm saying.
Well, if Metatron is based on Daniel 7, where the one like a son of man takes his seat beside the Ancient of Days, and the Son of Man who is coming is, in early Christian estimation, Jesus.
Yeah, but you're using the name Jesus anachronistically, going and just applying it to a Son of Man figure who wasn't necessarily called Jesus yet. You understand? You see where my issue is?
But if the one like a son of man is the son of El Elyon, the one ancient in days,
yeah,
and he is the representative of the Jews, that makes him Yahweh, and he is the angel of Yahweh. And if that is Jesus, then
if it gets called Jesus later, though, like, is it being, because Philo is not calling that thing Jesus?
Right.
But Philo does have that theology. Philo does have a Son of Man and a Logos and an heir of heaven. And there's two figures, not just one figure. That's all there. I just don't know if you can call Philo a Christian. I think you have to call him some sort of proto-Christian. I think Christianity is very specific, where you have a guy named Jesus of Nazareth who has all his mythology attributed to him, and then maybe some history is what I'm saying. We don't. That's the part that I'm. If that makes sense, what I'm saying, I'm trying to differentiate from Jewish cults that had Son of Man figure, which definitely exists, from people who actually thought that there was a guy named Jesus that lived in Nazareth, and then attributed all those things to a guy, whether he did or not. They thought he existed. That's what I'm saying.
Well, suppose they. Wait a minute. Well, if Barker is right, Son of God would have meant Yahweh, and Jesus would have been the angel of Yahweh, and in the Gospels.
Yeah.
Otherwise, why not call him Son of the Lord, if you presuppose that Yahweh and El Elyon were the same, as the Deuteronomic reformers said? So it seems to me, in fact, Eusebius thought Philo was a Christian, and that he had met Simon Peter and so forth, because they were so similar. Did he know
Therapeuti were too? He thought the Therapeuti, who Philo writes about, were Christians.
Yeah. Of course, Christian Winter said they were Buddhists.
If we define, like, I thought you were going to say we should define Christianity as any group that worships the Son of Man, messianic figure. Well, then Philo would be a Christian then. Philo would definitely
thought he was.
Yeah, so it just depends on how we define it, I guess. Because if Carrier really did find evidence that there was a group of Jews living in 40 BC, and I don't know, in Syria or something, I don't know, anywhere, and they were worshiping some figure called Jesus, then I think the idea that Jesus existed goes out the window. He's right about that. I just don't know if we have that yet. That's my issue.
Do you really need that if you say that Jesus is depicted early on as an Enoch-style figure?
No, exactly. Let me tell you why. Because if there really was a guy named Jesus who lived in Nazareth, we can have zero details about his life. Even he might not even died in Jerusalem. That might all be made up. The crucifixion can be made up. As long as there's one guy named Jesus and everything gets applied to him, there is still a guy, and mythicism is not true. Mythicism is true to 99%, except for that there was just a guy. But that's why I said if we found evidence of people like Philo in the 1st century BC or early 1st century AD who are literally like, yeah, the Jesus, he's going to come and save us, then I would not be like critical of this whole theory of. That's my thing. It's like the name Jesus We don't. My thing is, I don't think there's enough evidence to say that name comes from a historical person yet, or if it's all just made up. But I'm on the fence.
Well, actually,
So
so am I. I have a foot in the Jesus the Zealot hypothesis. To me, that's also a persuasive alternative. So I'm not a dogmatic believer in either one of them. But it seems to me if you've got Yahweh as the lesser Yahweh as the Metatron beside the throne of God, and Jesus is depicted in exactly the same terms, the name doesn't really mean a whole lot to me, especially since it means by definition, by etymology, Yahweh is salvation. Once
I
he's a
agree with that.
savior, you practically do have that name.
But not only that, let me just sort of agree with you just go with you for a second on this. The name Jesus, or like the name of it, the etymology, has to do with Yah in Greek, I should say, Jesus. We pointed out earlier that people named Jesus were called Jason in Greek, which is a name for healer. So you have this Yeh root. That Yeh root also gets applied to Apollo. Did you know this? Yeyo is a Apollonian name for Apollo. Let me see if I can pull this up. Yeyos Apollo. I'm just gonna go with you for a second on this. Why is my thing going so slow? So there's one of the names for Apollo is Yeyos. Hold on a second. Yeyos. I think it's in here. Yes, here it is. LSJ. Okay. So check this out. Apollo is the god of healing. His son is Asclepius. He's the healer. That's the healer dyad, if you will. But look at this. You have this epithet of Apollo, Yeyos. Same two letters that you get in Jesus' name. Yay. Okay. So from a mythicist point of view, this can be a construction of a god who's supposed to come and do miraculous healing. Because look, it's associated with Asclepius and healing. So you have, okay, look at this. Mournful, grievous, invoked with the cry, yea. Cry of mourning, but also associated with Yaomai, hence Asclepius, healing. So look at Yaomai. We look at Yaomai, you get this this healer type of imagery, to be healed, to recover, to counteract, a remedy of injustice. Now, think about this for a second. From a mythicist perspective, this actually makes more sense than Joshua, because in the stories, these are Greek stories. They're not Hebrew stories in the Gospels. In the stories of Jesus, he's healing people. He's raising the dead. He's making them see again. He's making their arms grow back. He's performing miracles like Apollo does. So you don't even need to go to like this. You can just say, oh, the name Jesus, they just constructed that with yay. Yeyos. It would have sounded amazing to a Greek audience. Jesus. Oh, he's got that yay root in his name. He must be a healer. He must be.
Was
you know what I mean?
that an abbreviation for Kanye? Sorry. Yeah, there's also an Asclepius story that is startlingly parallel to the road to Emmaus in Luke 24. And so there, I mean, that's it's not like
the reason why I brought this up is I'm not turned off the idea that Jesus has to be historical because his name's Jesus. His name actually sounds like it aligns with most fables. And this is a number one telltale sign of a fable. When the character's name, let's say the character's name is Sleepy, and he sleeps all the time in the story. That's not history. That's a fable. So when the guy's name is Jesus and he's out there healing people, I'm just going to call it that there's a possibility the name was constructed. One more thing
on the
this.
other hand, he could have been like Sleepy Joe Biden. Unfortunately, not a mythical figure.
But on top of that, though, on top of Yeyos or Yaomai being a sort of a healer type of connotation, What was I supposed to say again? I forgot what I was just going to say. I can't. I don't know. I just completely forgot where I was going with that. But yeah, no, he's in the stories. He's going around and he's healing people, and like that's the name of the person. So it's you have to think to yourself. You have to go. Well, maybe it's now I remember what I was going to say. All right, so I'm going to get a little bit conspiratorial here now, real quick, before we go to the next super chat. A little bit conspiratorial, because there is the gematria of Jesus. You ever look this up?
No.
The gematria of the name Jesus in Greek. Let me show you something. Let me see if I can find. Here it is. Perfect. I found the perfect image for this. 1 second. This is going to be cool. If this thing will load. Oh, here we go. All right. Share screen. Look at this. So, the gematria of Jesus's name in Greek, exactly 888. Now, why is that? That could be a coincidence. It just rounds off perfectly into 888. Now, 8 itself is a very famous number for the Pythagoreans. That's why it has the symbol of infinity. I can go on and on about the number 8, why the Pythagoreans loved 8. And by the way, the Valentinians are an early Christian sect who are Pythagoreans. They're the ones that wrote about this, by the way. This is how I know about this. This is part of Valentinus' doctrine. So, but here's the thing. He's the Logos, right? He's the Logos, and his name is Jesus. Now, what is the Logos? It's the Word, right? The Word of God. Well, guess what? The Greek alphabet has these things that are called monads, and then there's there's 8 single-digit letters. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 8, and then there's 8, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then there's another 8. I can't remember how to explain this, but there's 3 sections of the Greek. I think it's in this. I don't think it's in this article. Whoever made this article did not know about this, but I don't. Anyways, there's 3 sections of the Greek alphabet. I'm so butchering this right now, and there's 8, 8, and 8. So there's 8. They're called like monads. 8. I can't remember what it's called now. I have to look this up while you're reading the next super chat. But anyways, it's just kind of crazy. The Valentinians actually wrote about this in their heretical doctrines, that his name encompasses the Greek alphabet, because his name, his Jesus, encompasses the 8 monads, the 8 whatever the next one's called, and then the third one. I can't remember what it's called, but I have to pull it up now because now I sound stupid. But anyways, the name has some red flags. Is all I'm trying to say. Thoughts on Marion priority? I think they meant Marcion.
Well, I'm really in no position to judge it, but I am impressed very much by Marcus Vincent and the evidence he cites from church fathers about what Marcion claimed, namely that he had written the original gospel for his students in Rome, telling them not to share it with anybody, but they were so tickled with it they couldn't help themselves. And so soon there were pirate editions of it floating around by guys named Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And Marcion thought, he denounced them as forgers, and yet had to admit some of what they added wasn't bad. And so he incorporated some of it and came out with a published official version of it, and that the 4 pirate editions became of use in the Catholic community. And but then it gets more complicated than that. From everything he says, that strikes me as highly likely. I realize there are complications within complications, so I'm in no position to pretend to make a ruling on the matter, but it sounds pretty good to me.
That's very fascinating. All right, now I can explain this. And by the way, I think I was listening to Marcus last night, and I think he's brilliant. I got to start reading more of his stuff and trying to find out where he's going with that, because he sounds like it sounds convincing when he talks about. Anyways, all right, I couldn't explain what it is, but here it is. Greek alphabet has 3 sections, 8 monads. It's down here. Explain it. There's so there's 8 monads. 1 through 9 are all 1 digit. 1 through 9, 1 digit. The next group of letters, 8, has decads, 10 through 80. So there's 2 digits now, 10, 20, 30, and then, you know what I mean, 80. There's 8 of those. And the last group has 8 hectads, 100 through 800. So let's look at this. The name Jesus, who's the Logos, the Word of God, just happens by coincidence to have 8, 8, 8. Do you see what I'm saying? Alpha, and he's called the Alpha and Omega, right? Jesus Christos Alpha Omega. And his name has 8 monads, 8 decads, and 8 hectads. Now, to me, that's kind of crazy. If there was a guy named Jesus that ends up just kind of walking into this, I can see why the Valentinian Pythagoreans thought he was the son of God. They're obsessed with gematria.
Yeah.
So his name in Greek has this like all-encompassing 888. And I remind you, this is during the time when Abraxas is making an impact on Christianity. The school of Basilides in Alexandria, late 1st century, early 2nd century. They had the idea that Jesus was the son of Abraxas, whose name, Abrasax, has a gematria of 365, which is the entire cosmos, 365 days of a year of a solar calendar. So this might be some myth, like if mythicism is true, the name Jesus might have something to do with gematria and the sort of healing aspect.
Fascinating. Wow.
Anyways, back to Marcion. I just wanted to make sure I didn't sound like I was talking out of my ass.
No, I'm going to need to get going pretty soon. This is
all right. Let's wrap this up then. We got a couple last super chats, and I'll let you go. But yeah, thanks for coming on, by the way.
Oh, loads of fun.
So, okay, the next one says, if Livesey is right, then does that change mythicism?
Oh, not in the least. Though it's so different. Like you could say that there was no historical Paul, but there could well have been a Jesus, especially since mythicists have always made a big deal out of the fact that the epistles don't really seem to know the Jesus of the Gospels. So it wouldn't be too surprising if there was no Jesus, but there was a Paul, or the other way around. It's kind of tough to get the two together in some ways. But I don't think I mean, just like you can try to make room for a historical Jesus, even if you think Paul wrote the epistles, and ask yourself, why didn't he talk about the career of Jesus? You could still say the same thing if it wasn't Paul who wrote these letters. You just have the same question again. How do the author or authors not know about the growing tradition of Jesus? It's the same old question again. You just don't know who the author of the epistles, ignorant of Jesus, was. You could say there was no historical Jesus, but there was a Paul, which is what most conventional mythicists, if there's such a thing, have always said, that he's not really talking about a Jesus who had a brother named James. That's a misconstrual and so forth. So I don't know that things would be much different with mythicism or the authorship question. It's almost like saying if you're an atheist, that doesn't mean you don't believe Jesus existed. If you believe Jesus existed, that doesn't mean you have to believe there was a God. They're really unrelated issues.
Yeah, I hear you on that. Thank you for that super chat. Ewa Sabao, can you explain Dutch radicalism?
Well, it's the idea that F.C. Bauer was correct in pointing out inconsistencies in style and subject matter and historical references between the 13 epistles with Paul's name on them, and that most of them could be eliminated, leaving some version of the Hauptbriefe, the principal epistles, as he called them, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, and Romans. He thought those in the main were authentic. But Pearson, Neighbor, Van Eysing, Bruno Bauer, von Manen, and others said he stopped short because the same arguments can be applied to the big four and to show that they can't have been written by the same person. For example, in 1 Corinthians 15, if it means anything, the author is saying, now, here's what I first learned from the apostles, that Jesus died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures and rose and all that stuff and appeared to Tom, Dick, and Harry. But in Galatians chapter 1, he says, hey, I didn't receive my gospel from any human source. It came directly from the Lord. Wait a minute, the same guy wrote both of these? I don't think so. He couldn't have, unless he's some kind of multiple personality or is just a liar. So he kind of marks that off. And then the Dutch radicals went even further and said, it doesn't even appear that something like 1 Corinthians is a single letter. It appears to be a patchwork quilt of different conflicting Pauline position papers on, can women speak in the public assembly or can they not? Can you eat food offered to idols or not? Can you believe in esoteric wisdom or not? Do apostles have the right to be supported by their congregations or not? What about celibacy? It's like you hear one and then the opposite again and again.
Yeah.
Or is he trying to convince the Corinthians that there's life after death, or that Jesus rose and that therefore we will? What? It just doesn't seem like it makes coherent sense. And as my professor Darrell Dowdy said, if you look at them closely, any of the epistles of Paul, and look at any commentary, they're all trying to trace a coherent thread of argument. How does this relate to what we just read? Maybe he's implying this and that. When we see that in the Gospels, we now know to recognize these things are patchworks. There is no logical connection. And so different sources went into the Gospels. Why not the epistles? Well, the Dutch radicals were already saying stuff like this, and they said, come on. Or there are seeming anachronisms. Paul tells the Thessalonians or whoever it is, now you stick to the traditions as I taught them. Wait a minute, Paul founded this church a couple of months ago and there are traditions or historical retrospective.
It's always been my big problem that I've been trying to raise is, who is Paul writing to that knows all this stuff?
Yeah.
If it's so early on.
And like
yeah,
you said,
don't worry about it, because we're all saved in Christ Jesus. Yep. Who are these people? How did someone in Philippi, Macedonia, all the way in Macedonia, know what's going on in Israel? How do they know this?
Yeah, most of the 500 brethren are still around. You can go ask them. Of course, I'm not telling you any names or where you might find them.
They got in their private jets and flew around the Mediterranean to tell everyone what's going on.
Yeah, and Livesey says, who collected these? How did they know where to go to find copies? Did they have them emailed to each other?
It makes no sense.
Of a gun. I never thought of that.
It's like no one thinks about this stuff, but it's like everyday common sense logistics.
Yep.
And no one just thinks about it. You're right. It's a really interesting problem. But thank you for that super chat. S. Mill says, why wouldn't Marcion include Acts in his New Testament if they use it to write Marcion's Paul letters, according to Livesey? Marcion loved Paul and would have included Acts like he included his version of Luke. That's an interesting question.
I don't think her basic theory really depends on the idea that Acts She's saying that it preceded the Pauline epistles, as I remember.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's
she thinks the
true.
Pauline epistles are responding to Acts. That's what she thinks.
Well, there are elements like in Galatians, it seems pretty obvious in the first couple of chapters that somebody is trying to write a direct refutation of the events of Acts following Paul's conversion. So that seems to me to be a cross-talk thing, but it implies that part of Galatians might be pre-Acts and part post-Acts. She doesn't deal with a theory nobody but me does anymore, of C.C. Torrey, who said that that what he called first Acts, chapters 1 through 15, culminating in the Jerusalem conference, was written in Aramaic, and the Greek has these Semitisms that you mentioned. It sort of sounds like the Septuagint, translated Greek, but the structure and all that seems to be Semitic or Aramaic. But that Polycarp or someone translated that into Greek, but then decided to follow it up with what Torrey called second Acts, which has all the Peter-Paul parallels, which Bauer made so much of. And that's chapters 16 through 28. And that's originally written in Greek and sounds that way. So the construction of Acts is, you can't just assume it was written in one setting. And the same with the patchwork epistles. Now, Livesey is saying that it's like C.S. Lewis writing the screw tape letters, or Seneca writing the moral epistles, that he just sat down and wrote the whole thing. But if you combine that with traditional Dutch radicals, whom she mentions, it may not be that simple. You're talking about somebody constructing the Pauline corpus from various bits and pieces by different Paulinists. I think that's easily compatible with what she's saying. It just complicates it more, but it doesn't violate the basic premise of her theory. So I'm not so sure. Like, did they come up with the addresses for the epistles by choosing places mentioned in Acts, or did they get the place names in Acts from the epistles? It seems equally likely to me. And you've got the same debate with, do the epistles depend upon Acts or vice versa? Like Richard Purvo argued that, yeah, Acts knows the epistles. David Oliver Smith says the epistles know the Gospels. I find that unconvincing, but you can argue it. And so it's very difficult to say any of these things.
No, you're right.
I don't think it really debunks, it's not a fatal argument against any of it.
Yeah, because either way, it can be, you can fall into circular argumentation that this one's came first, therefore this one knows about this one. But it's like when if you just traded the axiom and go, no, this one came first, you can almost see it makes sense both ways.
It does. That's right. That's why it's so difficult to be sure.
Either way. Yeah. Interesting point. Thank you for that super chat. We got two more, I think. Yeah, two more. J Frog in the house says, can Dr. Bob please finish or maybe redo his series breaking down the book of Revelation? It was such a good listen.
Oh, did I do that on the Bible Geek?
Probably a long time ago.
I did some version of that more recently. Yeah, I can do that on some. I may be starting the Bible Geek on my own channel soon, and I could definitely do it there. I wouldn't presume to hijack anybody's show for what would probably have to be more than one episode, but I'll try to get to that. You can read a pretty detailed commentary I did on it in, I think it's volume 3 of my book, Holy Fable, which is on Amazon. I bet you'd enjoy that more than hearing me gust on interminably anyway.
Yeah, what's the website for that?
Well, it's on Amazon, but yeah, I don't have the text up. I'm sorry.
What's your website called? What's your website called?
robertmprice.mindvendor.com. But you can just look up my name, Robert M. Price, on Amazon, and most of my books are listed there. And this would be in the third volume of my Holy Fable series. There are 4 volumes of it.
All right. There you go. So you can check that out. And thank you for that super chat. And then hopefully you'll have that coming out. Esoteric Philosopher first drops $4.99. And thank you for that very much. And says, and another $4.99. Thank you for that. Dr. Bob, did Ebionites portray Yahweh as the evil one in the Sermon on the Mount, or another group? For example, there are more than yes or no is of evil.
Yeah, where he says, don't swear. You always heard that you shall fulfill your vows. But I say don't vow, that the swear an oath. Just be the kind of person, let your yes be yes, your no be no. People won't demand anything else, because if you have to resort to say, no, honest, I swear this is true, that implies usually you couldn't trust me, but this time it's true. No, you see, that comes from hoponeros, the evil one, or just evil. We don't know which is intended. And if he's saying that you have heard it said, you shall keep your oaths to the Lord. If he's saying, aha, oaths come from the evil one, would that mean that he's a Marcionite, or that a Marcionite says it? But Marcion didn't think that the Creator was evil. There were Gnostics who thought that.
Yes.
Then was the demiurge. And well, so did Marcion, but he didn't think the Creator, the demiurge, was
he was more
evil.
like Philo. He was more like Philo believed in 2 gods, one of them being the Logos, and the other one being the dark opposite. Like one of them is light, and one of them is dark, but they're twins basically. I think Marcion is following in with Philo.
Like he said that the 2 cherubim on the Ark of the Covenant, one was Yahweh, one was Elohim, and Yahweh was justice, and Elohim was mercy, or maybe it was the other way around. That is more like Marcion. He said
that's why I think Marcion is just a regular Platonist that's taking this Jewish scriptures to task. That's all he's doing.
That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. But then he wouldn't be evil, though. That's my point.
No, exactly.
But there were Gnostics that thought that.
Yeah, and he could have been going through the scriptures and deciding which parts of the text was the good God, which part of the text was the bad God. That might be an option too. But it doesn't necessarily mean the God of the Jews.
Valentinian, he thought that you needed to know the false pericopes, and the Ebionites said that too, that it doesn't all come from God. And Jesus came to reveal what was legit and what wasn't, which sounds like a crazy thing, but Jeremiah already says it in chapter 7 and 8. In chapter 7, he says that God said, when did I ever give laws about sacrificing beasts and so on? And then in the next chapter, he says, the lying pen of the scribes has falsified the Torah. That's a shocker. But that's literally what it says. Well, the Ebionites said, of course, yes. And that's why you can see these things like hideous animal sacrifice laws. God wanted a butcher shop religion, as Harry Emerson Fosdick called it. Not a chance.
Yeah, and check this out. I'm just moving your super chat away so you can see this. On Confusion of Tongues, and it's Philo writes this. He says, and even if there be not as yet anyone who is worthy to be called Son of God, nevertheless, let him labor earnestly to be adorned according to his firstborn Logos. That's the word in Greek. I know this because I've seen it a million times. The eldest of his angels, as the great archangel of many names, for he is called the authority, the name of God, and the word, and the man, according to God's image, and he who sees Israel. And then he says, that's what he says in that passage. But then he says, where's the one where he's talking about the second God? I thought this article had this in here. Let me see. necessary was the Logos appointed as judge and mediator, who was called angel. Shit, I don't know where. Okay, anyways, in Philo, no, this is it right here. Here it is. Flight, who is the air. The divine Logos, which is above these, does not come in any visible appearance, in so much as is not to see any of the things that come under the external senses, but itself an image of God, the most ancient of all objects of intellect of the whole world, and that which is placed in a close proximity to the only truly existing God, without any partition or distance being interposed between them. For it is said, I will speak unto thee from above the mercy seat in the midst between the two cherubim. And then it says, the one his beneficent power, in accordance with which he made the world, and respect of which he is called God. The other his chastening power, according to which he rules and governs what he has created, in respect of which he is further denominated Lord. And these two here states to be divided in the middle by him standing above them both. For, says he, I will speak to you from above the mercy seat in the midst between the two cherubims, that he might show that the most ancient powers of the living God are equal. That is to say, his beneficent and chastising power being both divided by the same dividing word. Anyways, there's other parts of Philo. I don't know why he doesn't have it in here. There's other parts of Philo where he says they have the same name and that like they're identical, but one of them's bad, one of them's good. It's in here. So
this reminds me of Martin Luther speaking of the left and right hands of God.
Yeah.
That there have to be soldiers and executioners, or things will be chaos. But that is not the proper work of Christians, but it has to be done. And those who do it are the left hand of God.
Yep. And then of course you also have Azazel and the offering of Azazel.
Mm-hmm.
Who is that offering towards? Is that another god there? Is Philo legitimately representing some sort of interpretation of Jewish theology that was already there?
That's what new? Margaret Barker says.
Yeah.
What a genius. In her books, The Older Testament and The Great Angel and various others, she is really, she's got X-ray vision in the text.
Wow. Yeah, it's Leviticus 16:10. Let me pull that up right now. Leviticus, where is it? Leviticus. Let me share my screen, and then we can get going pretty soon. Or if you have to go, you can always bounce whatever you need. Let me just, if you don't mind, can I show you this before you go?
Yeah, please. Yes.
Right. Leviticus 16. And then let's do this. Let's get us a Hebrew version to look at, and of course a Greek version to look at. Septuagint. Okay. So what the hell? Why is there two of them? I'll just get rid of this one. All right, so 16:10 says, the goat was chosen by Lot as the scapegoat, shall be presented alive before the Lord to make atonement by sending it into the wilderness as a scapegoat. Now, if we look at what it actually says, let's see. I thought it's called Azazel in here.
Yeah, one is for Yahweh and one is for Azazel or whatever.
Yeah. And here, so when Aaron presents the bull for his sin offering, he makes atonement for himself and his household. He is to slaughter the bull for his own sin offering. Then he must take a censer full of burning coals in the altar and 2 handfuls of finely ground fragrant incense and take them inside the veil. He has to put the incense in the fire. Let me just do a word search. Maybe it's amazing. Maybe it's just in the Hebrew. Let me just look at Leviticus 16:8 through 10, and then 26. The man who releases the goat as the scapegoat must wash his clothes. So let's see. We have I don't see Azazel in here. Anyways, you get the point. I wasn't prepared for this verse. I just pulled it up. But that's what they called it. They called it Azazel. Yeah. What do you? Any thoughts on this?
Well, the demons lived in the desert, which is why Jesus goes to the desert to be tempted by the devil. And in his parable, where the demon goes out of a guy and searches through waste places and finds 7 more demons worse than him, and they all decide to share the rent payments and go back to the original victim, and so forth. Well, they're in the desert, which all of this kind of fits with. That's where you find the demons.
Yeah,
and they're sick of the heat and dryness, and so they want to possess nice, warm, wet human bodies.
Yeah, I just found it. So it's right here. Azazel, right here. Lo means 2, and then Azazel, and then it just didn't have the translation I had, which just was garbage. It uses the word scapegoat instead of Azazel. But I think that's the correct translation to make this a noun, a proper noun, because that's how they viewed it as. They viewed it as it's an actual deity. So it says, "But the goat on which the lot fell for Azazel shall be set alive before Jehovah to make atonement." This is a good translation.
Yeah.
To send him away for Azazel into the wilderness. That American Standard Version. Thank you for that good translation, because that's how it has sounded to them. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
There's 2 different gods here. One of them's Azazel and one of them's Jehovah. Period. Right?
Yeah, that's right. They're this is the kind of stuff the Deuteronomic quote reform was trying to tidy up and streamline.
Yeah. Anyways, that's fascinating. So maybe Philo's 2 gods is not some new thing that he made up. Maybe he really was representing the true form of that he thought was Judaism.
Oh, yeah, that's what Barker points out in so many instances. Who was Chokhmah or Sophia? Well, Isis or Asherah, etc. And she just goes into numerous things. You think, yes. Why didn't I ever notice this?
Yeah.
Anyway, I better get going. I'm a little on the poop side. This has been lots of fun.
Let me pull up your website real quick while you get out of here. And here it is right here. Everybody, the link, I'll put it in the chat right now. And hit that up. You could drop a dono if you want. Feel free to drop him a $20 dono, as I'm about to do as well. And yeah, thank you for your time. And
thanks for having me.
Yeah, I guess I'm gonna close out myself. I guess I'll do that too. And yeah, you have just attained true gnosis.
You have just attained true gnosis. The demiurge has no power over